Pidgey, Pidgey, Pidgey. The sound of a Pidgey cawing filled the room of one Ash Ketchum as the clock struck 5 a.m., right on the dot. From under the Pokeball-designed covers of his light blue bedspread, the boy in question sat up with a yawn and then reached back to silence the Voltorb alarm clock he had received as a gift for Christmas the year before. After stretching his neck and doing the same for his arms above his head, the black-haired boy threw the covers off of himself and then climbed down off of his bunk once he took a few moments to quickly make his bed. He wouldn't be sleeping in it for some time to come, true enough, and he was certain his mother would probably strip the sheets and wash it all while he was gone. But, still, he was a tidy person. Once his feet touched the blue carpet, he cracked his neck a few more times and then came up on his toes before falling straight to the floor and doing a set of push-ups to wake himself up. Once he was done, the fully awake boy then went to his closet and put on a gray sweatsuit outfit to do his morning workout in. After this, he went up to assume his usual position on the roof so that he could stretch and watch the sun rise. Eventually, with the sun having risen just enough to appease him, Ash finished his warm-up and then climbed back down the drain spout, only this time he took it all the way to the ground. From there, he started up a slow jog out of his yard and onto the road so he could officially begin his morning run and exercise routine. As he settled into his run after a few minutes and became more acquainted with the still slightly cool air, the boy only had one thought going through his mind. Today is the day I finally start my journey. All the years of training are finally about to pay off. In just a few hours I'll have my first Pokémon and then I'll be on my way. He soon ran off the road after getting about half a mile from his house and ascended up onto one of the nice, reasonably tall hilly areas that overlooked most of Pallet Town. It was one of his favorite places to do his morning workouts, to be honest, and once at the top, he started doing several calisthenic and dynamic exercises. Starting with jumping jacks. As the steadily moving, aspiring young trainer to be gradually increased the rate of his exercise atop the hill, he began thinking about his future starter Pokémon. He had really given it a lot more thought in the short time he had been up, and the more he contemplated over it, the more he realized what he already knew the night before. Yes, he had been trying to compare every aspect of what he wanted in his first Pokémon to the Pichu he had met in the woods 5 years earlier. That small little electric type had so much fire and spirit in its eyes that Ash simply could not stop thinking about it. He had seriously considered going back into the woods near Professor Oak's ranch where he first met Pichu, in order to look for it, but every time he had, common sense would always win out. He knew he didn't have any business catching a Pokémon since he wasn't a registered trainer yet. And aside from that, he knew that the Pichu in question most likely was long gone by now. Thus, as loath as he was to admit it, he knew that the dream he had of reuniting with the small electric type was nothing more than a hapless hope that would probably never happen. Even still, it didn't make his dilemma on which starter Pokémon to choose any easier. After he finished his exercises up on the hill, Ash made his way back down and then finished his morning run at a brisker pace now that his body was fully warm. The good thing was that the morning wasn't as cold as when he first set out, and by the time he finished his workout, he had managed to work up quite the sweat. By the time Ash was finished with his run and walked through the front door of his house, he had a happy countenance on his face and a bright, positive outlook for the day ahead. The workout had worked wonders in getting him psyched for the upcoming events, as well as flooding his system full of cheer-inducing endorphins. However, when he kicked off his old black cross trainers, he had decided not to wear his new ones until he left for Professor Oak's. The newly arrived young Ketchum jumped in surprise when he heard from the kitchen. "Happy birthday, Ash." Spinning around, the now wide-eyed boy was shocked to see his mother already awake, fully dressed and holding her hands up in a gesture of surprise. What further shocked him was that his mother's best friend and his own surrogate aunt figure, Amelia Oak, was standing beside Adelia with a bright smile on her face as well. Amelia was a beautiful woman, much like Ash's own mother. She had long, dark brown hair that fell past her shoulders and a pretty, femininely defined face that accentuated her more delicate and soft features. Her eyes were the same dark color as her father, Professor Oak. She wore a black blouse with a light blue overcoat, and on her lower body was a long, elegant silk skirt that was all white in color. The skirt itself was frilly at the bottom. Her feet, though covered in long white socks currently, had been adorned in knee-high, black, low-heeled boots. Ash only just noticed them near the door. She also wore a silver bracelet on her right wrist that had a small, silver heart charm hanging off of it. To complete her stylish look was a small golden pendant shaped like a dragon's head hanging off of a thin golden chain. Upon seeing his mother and aunt standing in the wide doorway of the kitchen, Ash blinked a time or two before smiling brightly and hurrying over to them. "Wow, hey Mom, Aunt Amelia, good morning. I can't believe you're already up." Delia smiled sweetly at her child and tilted her head. "Well, of course I am. Today's your birthday and the day you start your Pokémon journey. I wasn't going to sleep through 1 minute of any of it." Amelia looked at her nephew, for all intents and purposes, and smiled as well. "And I don't suppose I would be much of an aunt if I didn't come by to tell my nephew happy birthday and to wish him good luck on his journey." The black-haired boy, feeling warm and happy inside at the show of love from his family, quickly stepped forward to hug his mother and then did the same to his aunt. Though, since he had grown quite tall for a 10-year-old and now stood at a steady 5'2", the height difference between he and the two women wasn't all that great anymore. "Thanks for being here to wish me a happy birthday and stuff, Aunt Amelia," he said with sincere gratitude as he smiled at the brunette after hugging her. His mentor's daughter Ice smiled back and tilted her head. "Well, you're so very welcome, kiddo." At that, Delia gestured for her son to come into the kitchen and smiled at him while doing so. "Come on into the kitchen, sweetie, I've already got your birthday breakfast all made up and waiting for you." Following her into the next room over with Amelia beside him, Ash looked toward the kitchen table and saw a delicious-looking small spread waiting him. His mother had indeed made his favorite. The meal consisted of banana protein pancakes, a small bowl of blueberry yogurt, cinnamon oat cereal, another small bowl of diced, mixed fruit and a glass of extra pulp orange juice. His mouth watering at the sight, Ash looked back at his mother with his eyes practically shining. "Oh wow Mom, that looks so good. Thank you." Giving a soft giggle of amusement, she fondly rubbed her hand through her son's messy hair and replied sweetly, "You're so very welcome, honey. Now go eat and enjoy." She didn't need to tell him twice. In the blink of an eye, Ash was sitting at the table with fork and knife already in hand as prepared to cut into the double-layer pancakes. While he ate, Delia went over to the counter and poured herself and Amelia a cup of coffee before the two older women walked back to the table and sat down. However, even as hungry as he was, the polite young boy still made sure to eat with the table manners his mother had been so ardent in teaching him. Amelia smiled in amusement and then looked over at her old friend. "I still can't believe Ash is so much neater when he eats than Richard was. I swear that man looked like a big, happy baby whenever he ate." Delia gave a small chortle of humor at her friend's comment and then sipped her coffee before replying, "Well, you never know if and when my Ash is going to be dining around a lady on his travels, and I didn't want him acting like a messy snubble at the dinner table. Arceus knows I love his father, but I swear I could never take him any place nice to eat." Both women shared an amused laugh at the memory of Ash's messy eater of a father, but then Delia looked back at her child. "Make sure you eat up good too, honey, because I made that breakfast specially with today in mind. You're going to need a lot of energy to start out on your journey, and that meal you're eating now should get you by until you can stop for lunch later in the day." The dark-haired child nodded and then wiped his mouth before responding, "Definitely, you don't gotta worry about that, Mom. I'm starving from my workout earlier and this food really hits the spot." Amelia seemed a little surprised at that and asked, "You worked out already this morning, Ash?" He looked at his aunt and nodded again. "Sure did." At that, she blinked before asking once more, "Whatever time did you get up at, dear?" Taking a drink of his orange juice, Ash looked up in thought for a moment before shrugging. 5 a.m., I think. I wanted to have enough time to work out before I went to Professor Oak's." The brunette in question blinked twice more before she replied in kind, "Well, I must say, that is very commendable, Ash. Dad told me how committed you were to your training, but I would have never thought you'd do something like that on the morning you received your first Pokémon. That's very different from what Gary decided to do." The slightly tan-skinned boy tilted his head at what she said and asked curiously, "What did he do?" "I was surprised to see you here and not at home with Gary since he's leaving today too." Amelia sighed and shook her head slightly as she considered her youngest child. "Oh, he's out in town right now celebrating that he's about to start his journey. He's with some of those older friends of his I don't approve of. I helped him pack everything together he would need last night, but he acted like he didn't need my help." She frowned sadly at the last part she said, but Delia took that time to look at her best friend from childhood with a curious expression adorning her pretty features. "Is he still planning on traveling around in that dangerous red sports car?" Amelia nodded in reply, frowning even more so, but Ash knitted his eyebrows together in a perplexed fashion. "What are you two talking about? How is Gary traveling?" The mother of the boy in question looked at her nephew. "Gary decided a few months ago that he was going to be making his journey with an older group of friends he was introduced to during his last year at Palette Primary." The obviously worried mother looked down at her coffee cup. "I don't know how he got introduced to them, but it's mostly a bunch of older teenaged girls that live in town. They know who Gary's grandfather is, and they also knew that he would be starting his Pokémon journey this year." She sighed once more and held the hand up, not holding onto her coffee mug. "These girls come from fairly well-to-do families, and apparently, one of them has a fancy red convertible. They talked Gary into going on his journey in it, with all of them tagging along." She then frowned again and grasped the cup with both hands. "As you know, Ash, my Gary isn't, well, he struggles with modesty, some might say. He just thinks these girls want to go around with him and be his adoring fan club because they see his potential. But, I personally am afraid that they are just using him to travel around and take advantage of the fame he's going to have being the grandson of Professor Oak." She shook her head slowly again, disappointment evident on her features. "I tried to talk him out of it, but you know Gary, so strong-willed and convinced that he's always right. I just hope he's smart enough not to use all the money Dad and I gave him to start his journey on these girls. To make matters worse, I told Daisy about this and she says they're trouble. She grew up with them apparently." Delia reached out and sympathetically patted her friend's arm while Ash frowned and finished up his yogurt bowl, feeling bad for both his aunt and Gary himself. Though, not wanting to dampen the mood, Amelia quickly shook herself from her gloom and focused on her nephew, smiling as she did. "So, Ash, do you have any plans for what you're going to do immediately after leaving Dad's lab? I know Gary is heading to Viridian City, and I imagine the other two getting their first Pokémon today will be doing the same. Will that be your own first destination as well?" The intelligent young boy in question merely shook his head in the negative, however, and finished up the fruit he was chewing before replying. "No, actually, it's not. After I get my first Pokémon, I'm gonna spend a week or two camping out somewhere before I head to Viridian City." He took a drink of juice before continuing. "I wanna get to know my Pokémon, develop a good relationship and do some serious training with them before we actually start out. I want us to be prepared for whatever wild Pokémon and other trainers we meet instead of heading out half-cocked. I want us to have a leg up." Delia smiled proudly at her son's forethought, but Amelia appeared both surprised and also impressed. "Really? Well, I have to say that it sounds like you really have a good plan ready, Ash." He shrugged modestly at his aunt and then picked up his spoon so that he could finish his cereal. "Professor Oak told me to be prepared at all times, and that's what I'm gonna do." "Be prepared." Amelia looked on her surrogate nephew fondly and respected the young man he was growing into. Inside, she couldn't help but wish that her own son could be a little more like the child that Delia had done such a remarkable job mostly raising by herself. After he was finally finished eating, Ash prepared to take his dishes to the sink and clean them, but he was stopped by his mother as Delia stood up. "Oh no, young man, don't you dare. For one, it's your birthday, and for two, you need to go and get cleaned up and ready to go. It's only 6:30 and you don't need to be there until 8, but you don't want to waste any time." He quickly nodded in agreement and then thanked his mother before rushing upstairs to get ready. After he left the kitchen, Amelia looked at her friend and smiled. Ash is such a good boy, he really is. Delia nodded as she took her child's dishes to the sink in order to clean them. He is. I'm going to miss him when he leaves, more than I can say. Amelia sighed and sipped her coffee. I know Delia, trust me I know. Daisy and I were so close when she was home and when she left back in May to go spend the summer in the Orange Islands with some of her friends, I felt her absence greatly. With Dad living at the lab almost 24/7 to care for all the Pokémon, I was mostly alone when Daisy left. The slightly younger brunette nodded and then asked as she came back to sit at the table and finish her coffee. After she returns, is Daisy still planning on going to Johto to attend that Pokémon nurse school? Amelia took another drink of her warm beverage. She is. Her dream is still to become a full-fledged, certified Pokémon nurse and then come back home eventually to set up and run Pallet Town's first Pokémon Center. Delia sipped her own coffee. Pallet is such a small town though, there might never really be a need for one. We never keep Pokémon trainers here after all, and Ash, Gary and those other two are the first to come out of Pallet itself in quite some time. We certainly have never had a reason to lay claim to any fame that would bring Pokémon trainers and other tourists here. Even Richard wasn't from Pallet Town, he just kept his Pokémon here. Amelia smiled in amusement at that. Well then I guess we'll just have to hope that one or both of our boys makes a big name for themselves as a trainer and brings some notoriety to this sleepy little town. She and Delia shared a laugh at that, but then afterwards, the former asked somewhat hesitantly. Out of curiosity, since you just mentioned it, did Richard ever finally tell you where he was from or anything about his family? Delia slowly shook her head and sighed. No, never. When it came to that he was a very private man. I asked him a time or two but Richard always found a reason or way to deflect the question. I don't know why and he never did open up about it, but I chose to respect his privacy and not pry too deeply. He was always an open and honest man when it came to everything else, so I'm sure his reasons for keeping that part of his life so secret was important. Amelia nodded to her explanation and didn't press any further. After they were done with their coffee, the two ladies cleaned up the kitchen together and then went out into the living room just as Ash himself came hurrying down from upstairs. He was now fully ready to head out and looked the part through and through. The son of Delia and Richard was now dressed in the red and black tracksuit his mother had purchased for him, and the young, fit Ketchum filled it out well. Though he definitely wasn't muscle-bound by any stretch of the word since he was only 10 years old, the form-fitting material looked good on the fit frame he possessed for his age. He also had on the matching cross trainers to go with the outfit, and since they were new, they hugged his feet nicely in the way that all newly purchased footwear did. On his back was the large travel pack that also matched his outfit. It was now thoroughly weighted down, not just with all of his supplies but also the black sleeping bag strapped to the top. The single-person tent itself was neatly tucked away inside of the pack. While having such a weighted-down pack would have normally been a burdensome task to contend with, Ash's 5 years of training ensured that completing such a feat was an easy matter for him. Specifically speaking, his 3 fighting-type coaches had made it a daily occurrence during training for the boy to carry around a large, heavy rock strapped to his back. Essentially, they had him walk long distances on the Oak Ranch with a 50-pound boulder tied to his person by rope, and even more than that, they also had him traverse strenuous terrain on the ranch as well. Amongst some of the thickest forests on Professor Oak's large preserve they made him march. As well as up the steepest mountain terrain, across deep and harsh rivers, swimming across a lake, and even through a marshy, boggy area on the far northern end of the ranch. An area Professor Oak and all the other Pokémon tended to routinely avoid. The only time they lightened the load on him was when he was swimming so that he didn't sink, and even then, he still swam with a fair bit of extra weight on him. Usually in the way of his coaches convincing some small Pokémon to ride on his back in order to provide the added weight. On land though, they steadily increased his load until he was eventually able to lug around an almost 80-pound rock without collapsing and falling under the weight. Thus, because of all that, his heavy travel pack was a far easier task to bear than giant rocks. As soon as she saw him, Delia clapped her hands and did a small leap in place. "Oh, look at you, honey. You look so handsome in your new outfit." Amelia smiled and nodded in agreement. "I agree with her, kiddo, you look pretty sharp." Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Ash rubbed the back of his neck and smiled modestly. "Thanks, it feels really comfortable and loose. I really like the shoes and the pack too, I think they're gonna work great." At that, Delia raised her finger and winked at her child. "Well, don't go running off just yet, I still need to give you your birthday present." She then went over to the cupboard under the stairs and opened it up before reaching in, searching around and finally pulling out a small square box that was wrapped in blue paper with Pokeball designs on the surface. Walking back over to her son, she held it out and smiled brightly. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Ash took the box from his mother after slipping the pack from his shoulders and then set about to quickly removing the wrapping. Then, once that was done, he opened the box to see what was laying within. What he saw resting on thin white wrapping paper made a soft smile cross his lips. It was a small, framed picture of his father, Richard, standing outside of their house holding Delia in his arms. Both were smiling brightly at the camera and they looked quite young, which meant that the picture had to have been taken some time after they got married and bought the house. The amber-eyed boy continued to smile gently and then ran his hand over the image of his father in the picture. Soon, he looked back up at his mother and nodded. "Thanks, Mom, I love it. Really, I do, thank you." Delia placed a hand on her boy's shoulder and smiled tenderly. "I thought this would be a good way to have both me and your dad with you on your journey." The grateful young man blinked back the tears he felt come up to his eyes and also swallowed down the lump forming in his throat before kneeling and carefully placing the small, black-framed picture in one of the deeper, main pouches of his pack. Before he could zip up the second pouch in the center though, where he had placed the picture, Amelia stopped him with a raised hand. "Wait a minute, birthday boy, I've got a present for you as well." He looked up at his aunt and stood as she reached into an inner pocket inside of her coat and pulled out a small, rectangular, gift-wrapped object. The paper itself was red with a green bow in the center. "Here, sweetie," she held it out to him and smiled warmly. "Happy birthday from all of us. And even though he wouldn't say it, I will, it's from Gary too." Curiously, Ash took the thin, wrapped item from her and swiftly undid the paper covering it until he could see what she had given him. When he did, the tender-hearted preteen felt a warmness settle in his belly again while his eyes once more became misty. The present in question ended up being another black-framed picture, only this one had himself, Professor Oak, his mother, Amelia, Daisy and Gary in it. The photograph itself had been taken at a time he remembered quite well. It had been about 4 years ago, when he and Gary were at the tender age of 6 and Daisy was 13. The time of the picture was right at the beginning of summer, on June 21st in fact, when Professor Oak had held a small barbecue for just the 6 of them. He recalled the date so well because it was on his birthday that they had held the small celebration. In the photograph, they were all gathered in the backyard behind the lab, just before reaching the fence that lead out onto the first few fields of the ranch. They were also sitting on the wooden picnic table that Professor Oak still had sitting there today. The professor himself was sitting on the far right end of the picnic table wearing brown shorts and a loose red, button-up vacation shirt. It was one of the few times Ash could personally remember seeing his mentor and grandfather figure wearing anything except his usual lab outfit. Amelia was sitting next to him dressed in a stylish, dark green sundress with a yellow sun hat on her head. Daisy was sitting next to her mother, looking just like a younger version of Amelia, only she was wearing a pretty white sundress without a hat, which allowed her long, beautiful, light brown hair to fall free across her shoulders. The young girl in question, who at the time of the picture had only just become a teenager, really did look like a smaller and younger clone of her mother. Only, to Ash, he had always thought the kind, sweet elder sister of Gary was even more beautiful than Amelia. For the admiring boy in question, he found her silky, light brown hair gorgeous and her rich, chocolate brown eyes, so different than anyone else's in her family, seemed to radiate a tender warmth. Her eyes were similar to Ash's in color, but in his humble opinion, he would never take more than a second to glance at his own. Whereas with Daisy, on the other hand, he could easily stare into her pretty irises and never grow bored. His mother had often teased him about having a crush on Samuel Oak's eldest grandchild, and though he would never admit it out of fear of being mercilessly tormented with embarrassing comments, she wasn't necessarily wrong. Anytime he was ever around his teacher's beautiful young granddaughter, his belly would always end up doing somersaults and flip-flops that could make an apom jealous. Quickly moving his eyes on from the picture of the then 13-year-old Daisy, he saw Gary sitting next to his sister. He was dressed in a dark t-shirt and green shorts. Unlike his grandfather, mother and sister, who were smiling in a more calm and peaceable manner, he had a big smile on his face. Sitting in the center of the table was Ash himself. He had been wearing a blue shirt with a Pokeball on the front and black shorts. On his other side, sitting on the left end of the table, was Delia. His mother was smiling in her normal cheerful manner with her arm around her son. She was dressed in a bright yellow sundress with flower designs on it. Ash himself was sitting in front of his birthday cake with 6 candles in it, the cake itself quite naturally being shaped like a Pokeball, and he had both hands extended out in front of him toward the camera in a peace sign. His face held the biggest grin possible. The picnic table had balloons of a variety of shapes and sizes tied to it as well, which all had the designs and pictures of different Pokémon printed onto each of them. And in the corner of the picture, next to Professor Oak, was the small red grill he had been tending to. As Ash looked at the picture of his smiling surrogate family and recalled the memorable day in question, the warmness in his belly grew. It was a great time after all. He had just met Arceus a year before and had been at his training routine for about the same amount of time. More so than that, Daisy was still young enough that she was around far more often, and Gary had not yet developed the arrogant, superior attitude that had all but ruined his and Ash's friendship. A fact that the dark-haired boy lamented over quite often, since Gary had always been his only real friend when they were younger. What really caught the now emotional young Ketchum's eyes the most though was how, at the bottom of the picture, a few words were scribbled with the names of each writer jotted out either beside or underneath them. "Happy birthday my boy, Oak. Happy birthday kiddo, Aunt Amelia. Happy birthday Ash, go rock the world, I believe in you, Daisy." Amelia's little note had the drawing of a heart beside her name, and Daisy's had a neatly drawn smiley face next to her own. Gary obviously hadn't written anything at all, but at the very bottom of the photograph, in bigger letters, were the words scrawled in Amelia's graceful handwriting. "So you don't forget about your whole family. You're as good as an oak and we love you Ash." All 3 of their names were signed under that last little note, and it was only when he saw that did 2 tears actually drop down his eyes. Quickly wiping them away a few seconds later though, Ash sniffed and then looked up at his aunt with grateful eyes. "Thank you Aunt Amelia." A warm smile spread across her lips as he stepped forward to hug her, and she returned it gladly, embracing her nephew tightly while replying in kind. "You're so very welcome Ash, and we all mean it. You're like family to us and we love you. Dad sees you as his own grandson and is always talking about you." After they separated from the hug, she looked down at the boy and I smiled while holding up a finger. "I got Daisy to do her part before she left last month. She hated that she wouldn't be here to see you and Gary off, but she wanted me to be sure to tell you that she is supporting you 100%. She also wants you to tell her all about your travels as soon as you see each other again." Ash gave his aunt a big grin in return, showing that he enthusiastically awaited that time, but it was at that same moment that his mother spoke up and got his attention. "Ash, you still have one present to go, but I don't have it. It's from Professor Oak actually, and once you get to the lab, he'll give it to you." Ash nodded in understanding and then knelt down to place the second photograph Amelia had given him into his pack next to the one from his mother. Afterwards, he slung the heavy backpack onto his shoulders and stood back up. "Thanks Mom, I really appreciate your gift again. If that's all that you guys have to give me, then I'm gonna go ahead and make my way to the lab. I wanna get there early so I can head out sooner." The 2 women shook their heads as Delia smiled and clasped her hands down in front of her. "You go ahead and get going honey, we'll both see you before you leave." Remember that a bunch of our neighbors and people we know want to come see you off as well, so we'll make some calls and then meet you at the gate in front of the lab before you leave." Ash nodded and then gave his mother and Amelia another hug before hurrying out the front door. They stared after him for a few moments fondly before Delia looked at her friend. "Well, shall we go wake up the neighborhood?" The slightly older brunette winked and then smirked mischievously. "Right behind you, Del. Let's drum up Ash a little going away celebration. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX way to his mentor's laboratory at a brisk pace. The air was slowly turning into the summer atmosphere it was supposed to be, and all around himself as he walked up the road to the lab he could hear the sounds of life. From the sounds of nature filling the small valley that Pallet resided within, or even the noises that people made as they awoke and started going about their day. All around he could hear life as it unfolded, and it added an extra little spring to his step. After a few minutes of steady foot travel, Ash at last found himself crossing the little bridge that went across the river, going through the gates and up the hedge-lined steps to the door of the Oak Lab. Feeling anxious butterflies flitting about in his belly as he anticipated what was to come, the boy reached up and knocked upon the door. After a moment of waiting, he heard shuffling inside before the door opened, and there stood the very same Pokémon professor that the entire lab belonged to. As soon as he saw the new arrival, Oak smiled warmly and gave a greeting that was the same. "Ash, my boy. Good morning and happy birthday." The better than punctual, messy-haired boy stepped inside of the lab and then turned to face his mentor with a smile. "Thanks, Professor. I hope I'm not too early?" he questioned a little bit nervously. Not all. Being early is always a good thing. The other 3 are going to be here at around 8 and it's only just now 7. That gives us plenty of time to get you all set up and registered as a trainer before you leave. In fact, since you're here early and I'm sure you're anxious to get going, we can go ahead and do everything for you right now." Ash immediately appeared excited. "Really, Professor? We can do it all now. We don't have to wait for the others." Professor Oak chuckled at the boy's enthusiasm and nodded. "Of course we can, my boy. I never said that no one could come early, only to be here at 8 sharp. You got here an hour early, and in my opinion, such dedication and commitment deserves a reward. Besides, it is your birthday today, and that reminds me. Stay here for a moment, Ash, I'll be right back." He nodded in understanding, and then Professor Oak walked over to his desk, near the couch, where he rummaged through the drawers for a time until finally finding what he was looking for. Then, while his student stood in the middle of the room, he walked over carrying a small brown parcel in his hands. Coming to stand before Ash again, he held out the small package and gestured for him to take it. The boy did so and looked at it in confusion before Professor Oak explained. "That is my gift to you, Ash. Go ahead and open it up." The now excited but still perplexed young man did so, and then, after fully opening it, he gasped at what he saw. Inside, laying upon a soft bed of blue cloth, was a black wristwatch-looking device with blue strips of coloring on the sides and bottom. It had a square touchscreen on the front of it and a big blue button up on the top right side of the device. There was also a black one above the screen. Professor Oak smiled and addressed the surprise that was on his pupil's face. "That, Ash, is an extransceiver. It is a communication device that allows you to have a multi-way call with up to 4 people at once. It is all done in video feature as well, so that you can see the person whom you are talking to." The professor reached out and touched the device with his finger. It also has a built-in satellite GPS navigation system. With it, you can be assured that you will never get lost. It also will tell you where all the best routes to travel on are located, and it shows you where all the towns and cities are in every region, no matter how big or small. The X-transceiver will display the location of places such as Pokémon centers, Pokémarts, hotels, Pokémon gyms and nearby attractions, as well as many other establishments and locales of interest. It has a search feature too that you can use to make finding a particular destination easier and with less time involved. If the place in question is registered in the X-transceiver's extensive satellite database, then you will always be able to find the location you want to head to. The gray-haired man smiled and crossed his arms behind himself. This device is the Unova region's answer to Johto's Pokazure, Hoenn's Pokénov and Sinnoh's Pokech. It is also the most advanced device in this particular line of equipment than the former three. In fact, it is not even going to be available in Unova itself yet for quite some time. Oak winked at his surrogate grandson and held up his finger. I had to pull a few strings with Unova's leading Pokémon researcher, Professor Aurea Juniper, to get me this. I simply told her that I had a special trainer in the wings who needed one and she managed to get her hands on this one. So don't be surprised when no one knows what this device is. Ash nodded dumbly at Professor Oak's explanation of what he now held and then began thanking him profusely for it. The older man just waved it off as no big deal, however, and then addressed the boy again. No need to thank me, Ash, it was my pleasure. Now, come back into the data filing room of the lab with me. I want to give you 2 more little surprises. The grateful boy didn't hesitate and followed his teacher to the aforementioned room of the lab in question. It was located through a door off to the left side of the ground floor research area. Of course, Ash knew the whole lab like the back of his hand since he had been there almost every day, for 5 years straight, training with Professor Oak. As they made their way to the data room in question, he slipped the extransceiver onto his right wrist and marveled at the fit. He slid the sleeve of his jacket down over the device though to save himself from potentially unending questions about what was on his wrist. Finally, they made it to the data room, which mostly consisted of a few tables and chairs, several filing cabinets and other such storage devices that held the professor's endless trove of research-oriented files and papers. The gray-haired researcher in question led Ash to a large computer monitor at the back of the room, which was built into the wall, and stopped in front of it. "Ah, Professor, why are we here?" he asked in confusion. The world-renowned Pokémon professor allowed a smile to cross his face and then began explaining to the boy his reason for bringing him to the room in question. "Ash, my boy, you have been learning under me for 5 years now and I promised you once that if you worked hard for me, it could potentially pay off for you in a big way. Do you remember me saying that?" "Yes, Professor, of course I remember. That's one reason why I worked so hard all this time," he answered passionately and enthusiastically. The grandfather of 2 chuckled and then continued. "I am glad to hear you say that, Ash. Because in these last 5 years of training you, I have been amazed at how fast you learn and how naturally adept you are at studying and researching Pokémon. I know I told you that if you worked hard enough it would open doors for you and I meant it. Originally, I intended to make you my official Pokémon research assistant on this very day if you succeeded in reaching my expectations." The Kanto professor frowned slightly. "However, to my great shock, you have already learned everything I have to teach you in a confined classroom setting. I never thought that, in only 5 years, you would have learned so much. That is why I decided against taking you as my assistant. Pokémon research assistants are basically apprentices to Pokémon researchers. They are there to learn everything that the professor in question has to teach them. You have already been like my apprentice all this time, merely unofficially. So, it would be pointless taking you as my assistant now." Delia's energetic son looked a little crestfallen at first upon hearing that but quickly recovered and smiled at his teacher. "That's okay, Professor. I'm just happy that you took the time to train me the last few years. I really appreciate it." As soon as he said those words, it sealed the deal for Professor Oak, and in that very same moment, his student passed a very crucial test. Instead of getting mad at the cryptic older man for alluding to the possibility of achieving great rewards for working so hard for 5 years, though only to actually receive nothing, Ash focused on the positives. Choosing to thank his mentor instead for all he had done to help him begin his journey. Needless to say, the leading authority on Pokémon and human relationships respected the maturity in his pupil, and that is what caused him to make his next proposition. "I'm not done, Ash." The wizened older man held his hand up and the boy in question looked at his mentor curiously, waiting for him to explain. Soon enough, the aged researcher continued. "Ash, what I am about to offer you has never been offered to someone your age, and I am only doing this because I believe you can handle it. I am willing to upload you into the Pokémon Researcher database as a Pokémon researcher in training." He appeared a little confused and voiced it. "What do you mean, Professor?" Professor Oak turned on the computer while he spoke. "A Pokémon researcher in training studies and works toward the goal of becoming a full-fledged Pokémon researcher, such as myself or any of the other region professors. All you need to do is either train under a certain region's professor for a time or go on your own journey and study Pokémon in different kinds of situations and environments." He then looked back at his student and held up a hand. "When you have learned everything necessary to qualify and become an actual Pokémon researcher, all you have to do then is find what field of Pokémon you want to specialize in studying, and then you get registered to whatever region you want to study out of as a certified Pokémon researcher." The red-shirted professor smiled. "I picked this option for you because I believed that it would fit well into your goal of becoming a Pokémon master. Your task will be to make sure to chronicle and record events you experience on your journey that you deem worthy of research and then compile them into a journal." Turning fully to the tracksuit-wearing boy, he laced his fingers together behind him. "After you attain and possess so much field experience and knowledge of Pokémon, myself or any of the other professors can then name you worthy of becoming a full-fledged Pokémon researcher." He then smiled in a knowing fashion. "So, what do you say, Ash? Interested?" The black-haired kid was still for a few moments and had nothing whatsoever to say, his brain processing everything he had just been told. However, as soon as his senses returned to himself, he excitedly began nodding like a bobblehead. "Yes, Professor Oak, I would love to someday be a Pokémon researcher like you. Thank you, thank you. I promise I'll work really hard." He nodded at his student's declaration and then turned back to the monitor in front of him. Oak typed in a few commands on the keyboard and then a picture of Ash popped up on the computer screen above. The boy with Z marks on his cheeks seemed confused by this and looked at the professor, wondering why his picture was already on the computer's database without his need to pose for one. His teacher soon answered his unspoken question. "I took the liberty of building your trainer profile already, Ash." He then gestured at the screen. "It is essentially a file on all your information, both personal and professional. All the information on Pokémon you have seen and obtained, gym badges you have collected, tournaments you have won, titles you have attained, and much more concerning your life as a Pokémon trainer can be found here on the International Pokémon Trainers Database. Or the IPTD for short." He then gestured his apprentice over for a closer look. "From here, anyone can view your history as a trainer. However, only your home region's professor, meaning the one who gave you your first Pokémon and Pokédex, can view your personal information. Your personal info consists of data on you personally. Your bodily statistics such as height, weight, hair color, eye color, and also your relations to other people." Sam Oak crossed his arms and continued his lecture. "In general, this entails your friends, family, colleagues, those you have registered into your communication devices, and people you know and or have professional agreements with." He gestured up at the monitor above. "One of the reasons why having a Pokédex is important is so that your home region's professor can continue to journal and record your accomplishments and all the Pokémon you have seen as you travel around on your journey." Ash looked at his picture closely, which was just a headshot of himself and the upper part of a black shirt he had been wearing on whatever day and time the photograph had been taken. It also acts as a form of ID for anyone you meet who might have questions as to the legitimacy of your identity. Since your Pokédex will be registered to you by me, anyone can see that information for themselves if you show it to them, and by so doing, it will prove your authenticity as a Pokémon trainer. He finally looked back at the 10-year-old. "Are you with me so far?" Ash nodded and then asked with a pointed finger. "Professor, why is my trainer profile dark?" The elder expert on all things Pokémon looked back at the monitor and saw what he was referring to. His whole page was dark, almost gray-looking in color. The Kanto professor then looked back at the boy and explained why. "The reason is because you are currently an inactive and unofficial Pokémon trainer, meaning that you do not yet have a Pokédex. As soon as I give you yours and register it to you, this whole page will be colored in with a white backdrop and all your stats will become visible and ready for edit. The still reasonably spry older man took a seat on the edge of the monitor's control board. Your Pokédex will officially recognize you as the trainer it is certified to upon registry and will begin to collect information on your achievements and the Pokémon that you have seen and obtained. Which is yet another reason why it is so important you never lose it. Each trainer's Pokédex is one of a kind and cannot be replaced. He then held up another of his fingers in an astute manner. Every time you do something Pokémon related, the information will be sent here to the lab and downloaded into my computer system's database. Also, anytime you are participating in a competition of any kind, like a league conference for instance, your Pokédex and trainer profile will show that you are currently participating in that tournament. He rested both hands on his right elevated knee. That is why, unless your regional professor does it beforehand, a Nurse Joy will have to register you for any sort of Pokémon League challenge circuit that you wish to undertake before you can actually begin. The information obtained through the registry needs to be recorded into your profile. This is how different skill levels and ranks of trainers are graded, through the information recorded on the database. After he was done explaining, Professor Oak went to a nearby tall, glass cabinet and unlocked it. He then pulled from the confines of said cabinet, inside of a neat little slotted storage compartment, a black and red, sleek new Pokédex. The old man went over to the computer afterwards and placed the device into a slot between the monitor and the control board and began typing more keys into the terminal. Once he was done a short time later, the professor pulled the Pokédex out of the slot and walked back to where Ash was standing. He pushed a button on the top right corner of the device and the small, high-tech looking machine came to life. The front cover of it slid up smoothly and automatically, on its own, and revealed that the top screen was for image display only while the bottom one was for touchscreen control. The very bottom part of the device, below the touchscreen, had a teleporter pad on it shaped like a red Pokeball. That was meant for the sending and receiving of Pokémon through the transfer system. When the small green light on the side of the handheld trainer device glowed, a robotic and noticeably male voice spoke from out of the Pokédex through the small speaker slots located at the bottom end on the backside. My name is Dexter. I was given and registered to Pokémon trainer Ash Ketchum from Professor Samuel Oak. Rank: Beginner Trainer. Titles: Pokémon Trainer. Tournaments Competitions 1. None. Pokémon Seen. 0. Pokémon Obtained. 0. Regions Visited. Kanto. Ash listened to the Pokédex in amazement. It already knew so much about him and it had just been registered to him. For the spirited young man, he found the small device now resting in his palm to be beyond amazing. It was almost unbelievable in some respects to the black-haired boy's fanciful-filled mind. That is merely a sampling of what your new Pokédex can do, my boy, but give it here for now please. Oak then held out his hand again and his surrogate grandson gave the device back to him. The professor soon went back over to the computer and reinserted the Pokédex into the system. He pulled up Ash's profile page afterwards, which was now bright and active with the aforementioned white background, and then clicked open a second page on the monitor. This particular one showed the son of Richard's profile page while the other displayed the Pokémon researcher's database. Professor Oak did a few things with his student's profile and then pulled out his Pokédex for the second time. Immediately afterward, the gray-haired man brought it back over to Ash and placed it in his hand. The boy pressed the same button on the top right corner that his mentor had earlier and the Pokédex slid open. He went to his information section and there under, titles, was something different. It now read but Dexter didn't speak this time. Trainer name: Ash Ketchum. Titles: Pokémon Trainer, Pokémon Researcher in Training. The easily excited young boy who was about to start out on his journey gave a pleased smile when he heard that. Then, he looked back at Gary's grandfather and nodded. Thanks, Professor, this is great, really. And the color of the Pokédex matches my pack and tracksuit too, I like that. The man in question chuckled and put his right hand into his coat pocket. Yes, my boy, you are quite welcome. Your mother thought you would like it if your Pokédex was custom painted to match your outfit. I had it specially ordered about a month ago from Sylph Company. The short-haired professor then shut off the computer and looked back at his student afterwards. Now, "Come with me, Ash, we're done here." He quickly obliged and was just getting ready to pocket his Pokédex when Oak reached into a drawer under the computer terminal and drew out from it two more items. The first was a brown journal that had the words, "Pokémon Research Notes," on the front. The second was a black, clip-on carrying case that looked to be the same size as the Pokédex itself. Ash took both, thanking the professor again as he did, and put the journal into his pack, inside the top section of it. After that, he slipped the Pokédex into its case and attached it to his left side. The famous Pokémon researcher smiled in approval at the look and then began walking out of the room they were in, gesturing for the boy to follow as he did. When they were nearly out though, Oak stopped and turned around to face his pupil again. "By the way, Ash, before I forget, your Pokédex and X-Transceiver are travel resistant, which means that very few things will be able to destroy them. Water and falls from high places are guaranteed not to damage them. At least within reason. I think your mother told me something about your pack being water resistant as well when she got it for you, am I correct?" He nodded positively. "Yeah, it is. No moisture can get in except for any kind of liquid I carry around inside of it." Professor Oak nodded in understanding and then they resumed their walk out of the data room and into the main research area. The next room they went to was one that Ash knew about well. It was the lab's workshop area, where Professor Oak worked on new projects when he wasn't studying or researching Pokémon. The room itself was located directly across the ground floor through yet another green door. This one was situated near a third door that led to the professor's private living quarters, which was where he stayed at most of the time instead of going home to the Oak House in Pallet. That house in question was the permanent residence of Amelia, Gary and Daisy, his family. After opening the door that led into the workshop, the old man flipped the lights on and was soon joined by Ash, whom looked around. The workshop was around 20 foot wide by 15 foot long and the height was about 8 feet from floor to ceiling. The room itself was filled with various shelves and cabinets, each one being used as storage for tools, miscellaneous equipment and items that the professor had worked on. Both finished and unfinished. There were 3 sets of overhead lights that brightly illuminated the room and off to the far left side was a workstation built into the wall. On the table itself were papers, schematics, various tools, objects that had no clear purpose and even an empty coffee mug. However, what really drew Ash's gaze was the large, rectangular, metal table in the center of the room that was currently taken up entirely by a wide variety of strange, shiny and small metallic-looking items. Being gestured by his mentor to do so, he walked closer for a better look and soon realized that they were all miniaturized weights. Dumbbells, barbells, weights that strapped to the body and even ones that he had never seen the design of before. Professor Oak sensed the boy's confusion and spoke on it. "What you see here, Ash, are all weights used to train Pokémon. They are a special kind of exercise weights that can be shrunken down to minuscule size. It reduces not only the size of them but also the overall mass as well." The older man picked up one miniature dumbbell that was fashioned out of gleaming stainless steel. There is no difference whatsoever between a regular dumbbell and these collapsible weights, aside from the fact that they are capable of shrinking, of course. Since they can be made so small and light, they are the perfect training tool to carry around on long journeys. He then placed the weight down and gestured at them all. "These were created exclusively for Pokémon trainers and I just got them shipped here to the lab from Professor Sycamore in the Kalos region. He and his assistants were the ones that devised this ingenious creation." The young Ketchum looked at the Pokémon expert oddly. "But Professor, how does it work? The shrinking process, I mean. And what about some of these weird-looking weights that I've never seen before?" Oak smiled and picked up the same dumbbell he had just placed down. He then put it on the ground and pressed a button on the side of the strength training item. Instantly, the weight grew until it soon looked just like a regular, albeit space-age, 25-pound dumbbell. Ash, after blinking at it in shock, reached down and lifted the weight up. He was amazed to find that it felt just like a normal dumbbell would. His mentor had not been exaggerating when he said there were no differences between a regular weight and these so-called shrinkable ones. He eventually put it down and then looked at Gary's grandfather again. How many weight sizes do these come in, and you still didn't tell me yet why there are some types of weights here that I've never seen before. Professor Oak walked over and enlarged several of the unusual weights after picking them up and setting them down on the ground. He then stepped back and answered the questions. My boy, the weight sizes here among this collection ranges from 10 pounds for the smaller Pokémon to several thousand pounds for extremely heavy ones, like Snorlax for instance. As for these strange weights you see here. He then knelt down and lifted up an odd-looking body weight to show off, which was lighter than some of the others. Several of these are body weights, and they are for different types of Pokémon who cannot train using weights in the normal fashion. Some examples here are body weights for flying-type Pokémon. He gestured to one of the weights in question, which resembled a metal body harness that strapped on at the front and back by black clips. These weights are perfect for increasing a flying-type's speed, agility and endurance. You simply select the weight you want to use, enlarge it and strap it onto your Pokémon. Oak then pointed to other body harness weights that looked similar but were more streamlined in appearance. There are also some for water-type Pokémon to wear while training in the water. It increases resistance and adds more difficulty to any aquatic workout regimen. He held up one of the water-type body weights and gestured at it with one hand. They help make the Pokémon in question stronger, faster, more agile and quicker, not only in the water but out as well. Much like the other ones I showed you do for flying types. The main difference between them is that the aquatic ones are coated with a special anti-rust agent made from, among other things, seal blubber and tentacool ink. The graying-haired professor shrunk all the weights again and placed them back on the table. The mechanics behind these training devices are fascinating. Each one has at its core a tiny amount of Dynamax ore. Professor Sycamore and his assistants found a way to reverse the enlarging effect of the Dynamax process so that the ore itself would respond to an electrical pulse command to shrink, as well as grow. He then gestured to the body weights exclusively. These body harness weights also possess the distinct function of being able to increase and decrease the amount of weight loaded onto your Pokémon. You can control it with this button here. Oak enlarged one of the harnesses again and then pointed to a small black button underneath the one in the center of the weight that shrunk and grew it. You just double tap and hold to increase the load and triple tap and hold to decrease it. He stepped back after shrinking the harness down and then gestured at the table full of miniaturized weights. There is a different type of weight set here for almost any training need, with any Pokémon. And that is why I am giving them to you, Ash. The young boy in question's jaw almost dropped to the ground. Are you serious? Professor, I can't let you do that. These training weights are really valuable, especially if they came from the Kalos region and are so new. Besides, if they're anything like my X-Transceiver from Unova, then this type of training weight won't even be seen on the market in who knows how long. He held out his arms. Besides, how am I gonna carry thousands of pounds of weight around in my pack? I've gotten a lot stronger in 5 years, but not that strong. Even shrunken down, they still have to be heavy when carried all at one time. The smiling researcher held up a hand to silence him, and Ash became quiet as he lowered that same hand again and put it into his coat pocket. My boy, these training weights were given to me to do with what I wish. You didn't just learn from me in the last 5 years, you also helped me tremendously in many ways when it came to the Pokémon here at the lab. His smile became warm and grandfatherly. This is my way of thanking you for everything you did here. Besides, you want to be a great trainer, do you not? This is a good way to get started. You will need to train hard, and these weights will help you and your Pokémon reach your full potential. So please, take them. And as for the weight of them all, remember, in their shrunken form, thousands of pounds will feel only to be a few. He stared at his teacher for a moment or two and then finally nodded, accepting the gift graciously. The professor smiled approvingly and then went over to one of the nearby shelves and picked up off of it a silver, travel-sized, metallic case. It had the symbol of weights on the front, which led Ash to believe that it was most likely what he would be keeping his new training items in. Amelia's father began putting all of the many shrunken weights into the metal case, and then once he was finished, he gave it to his pupil. The boy took the case cautiously at first, afraid the whole thing would weigh an unfeasible amount and therefore fall from his hands as soon as he took it, potentially even taking him with it. To his great surprise, however, the whole case felt light as a feather. In his estimate it was probably 10 pounds, at most, which amazed him considering that there were thousands of pounds inside of one small box. Ash stowed the case away in his pack after that for safekeeping and then turned back to the man that was always so kind to him. "Thanks again, Professor. I really appreciate this." The kindly and wizened researcher smiled and nodded in reply to his surrogate grandson's gratitude. He then reached out to fondly pat his shoulder before leading his student back to the door. "Once again, you are most welcome. Now," old Sam Oak looked down and winked at Ash. "What do you say we go and pick out that starter, boy?" The tracksuit-wearing 10-year-old responded with a beaming grin and a fast head nod. "Yes, sir. I've been ready since I was born." Professor Oak actually laughed aloud in mirthful amusement at that and clapped the boy's shoulder again before opening the door and leading them back out into the main area of the lab. Afterwards, he and Ash walked across the ground floor, up the left side stairs that went up onto the loft and then through the green door that lead to the secondary research room on the second floor. Once they reached the top of those steps as well, the professor ambled over to the center of the room where the circular machine that held the 3 starter Pokeballs were located. Ash followed him, his heart beating at an excited pace and anxiousness flowing through every fiber of his being since the day he had long awaited was finally upon him. As soon as he reached the device in question, his amber eyes glanced over the 3 shiny new Pokeballs that were spaced in a perfectly even circle on top of the metallic surface. One had a blue water drop symbol atop of it, the second a green leaf and the third a flame emblem. The professor stood off to the side of the machine and allowed Ash to stand in front of it for his selection. He then cleared his throat and spoke. "Here you are, my boy, choose whichever one you want. The middle Pokeball with the water drop emblem on the top holds the water type, Squirtle. The one on the left that has the leaf symbol holds the grass type, Bulbasaur. And the one on the right with the flame insignia holds the fire type, Charmander. Choose wisely." The boy looked at and examined all 3 Pokeballs seriously, contemplating which Pokémon was best to take with him as his first. After all, such a decision was no laughing matter and would dictate the direction of his journey from the very outset. He knew he needed to be as careful as possible in choosing. There were no take-backs, it was a lifelong commitment. The longer he stood there trying to decide, however, his hand hovering over first one and then another of the 3 balls, the more that images of the little Pichu from 5 years earlier kept coming into his mind. He tried to shake his head to clear it, but no matter what he did, nothing worked. He simply could not stop thinking about that tiny mouse Pokémon. Its bravery, potential, determination, spirit and the raw power he felt whenever Pichu accidentally shocked him kept coming right back to the forefront of Ash's mind. He tried to tell himself that it was impossible to have that little Pokémon as his first and to just focus on the choices in front of him instead. But, alas, he was fighting a losing battle. Finally, after a long period of time, he stepped away from the machine and looked at the older man. "I'm sorry, Professor, but none of these Pokémon feel right for me. 5 years ago, I saved a Pichu in the woods outside of the ranch and I sort of bonded with it through that experience." The passion he felt for Pichu could be seen shining in his eyes. "That little Pokémon was so full of fire and spirit and I guess I just really wished it could have been my starter Pokémon instead. We weren't together long, but the time we were I could just sense that Pichu was special. But now," he frowned and looked toward the ground sadly. "I haven't seen it in 5 years and I know it's crazy to get hung up over something like this, but no matter how hard I try now, nothing else seems right to me. I'm trying to see myself with Bulbasaur, Squirtle or Charmander, but instead, I keep seeing Pichu. I just can't help it." Professor Oak was stunned. He never knew of the little electric type that his pupil was talking about until right now. It was clear to him though by the look on Ash's face and the sincerity in his words that he had indeed formed a bond with the small Pokémon in question, and now, he was having an arduous time letting that bond go. After a time of contemplating over the matter, however, he suddenly had an idea. He couldn't give Ash the Pichu that he was talking about, but he could give him a Pokémon very close to it. In his mind, it could even help the boy get over the bond with the wild Pokémon that he had befriended. That is, of course, if said Pokémon didn't fry his student first or outright refuse to be his partner and utterly ignore him. Normally, such a Pokémon would never go to a rookie trainer. However, Ash had proven that he was special on more than one occasion, so maybe, just maybe, he could handle it. With that in mind, he decided that he would let Delia's son try his hand at training the Pokémon he was considering. Therefore, he looked at the messy-haired boy with a serious visage and addressed him. "Ash, I think I might just have one other Pokémon that could suit you. Albeit, this is a long shot." He then pressed a button on the side of the machine, and as he did, a compartment opened in the center of it. Then, from out of the hole itself emerged a fourth Pokeball that was emblazoned on its top with a lightning bolt symbol. Once the new ball appeared, the young boy appeared confused. "What Pokémon is in there, Professor?" Oak put his hands into his coat pockets and looked at the Pokeball that was now in the midst of the other three. "This one holds a Pokémon that I myself just captured this morning before you got here, Ash. It was out back chewing on the cable wires that led from the main receiver pole to the lab." The old man shook his head. "At first I simply tried to shoo it off, but the little rascal was persistent and surprisingly very aggressive. It almost did me serious harm and showed itself to be so dangerous that I actually had to go out onto the ranch and enlist the aid of one of the Pokémon to help me." The tan-skinned boy's eyes went wide as his mentor continued the tale. "I obtained the aid of a Vileplume, and together, we went back to the lab and battled with this Pokémon. I once more found myself surprised at its power and ferocity, but at last, Vileplume managed to knock it out with sleep powder. And even that was no easy feat." The short-haired professor nodded toward the device that the Pokeballs were all resting on. "I then captured it and placed it into this storage machine until I could decide what to do with it later." The very seasoned Pokémon researcher looked at the young boy he was about to make an official trainer. "Now Ash, you must listen very carefully to what I am about to say." He held up a finger and knitted his eyebrows together. "I would typically never even consider giving such a Pokémon to a new trainer, but I have faith and confidence in your ability to handle it. But if you cannot, there will be no shame in admitting it. In fact, I want you to promise me that if you can't, you will tell me so that I can take this Pokémon back. I do not want you getting hurt. Do you promise?" Now fully intrigued and extremely curious, Ash nodded resolutely. "I promise, Professor." Having given his word, he watched Oak grab the Pokeball with the lightning symbol and then release the Pokémon from inside of it. What came out of the ball surprised Ash greatly. When the small creature in question materialized out of the bright light, it was revealed to be a small, yellow, rodent-like Pokémon that had 2 red circles on its cheeks, black-tipped ears, 3 brown stripes on its back, and a tail shaped like a thunderbolt. The well-learned boy instantly recognized it as none other than a Pikachu. The small electric type shook its head when it came out of the ball and then announced its name in huffy distaste from being confined in the circular capture device. Pika. After the newly released Pokémon had gained its bearings and glanced around to take stock of where it was, the yellow rodent's dark eyes finally landed on Professor Oak. As soon as it saw him, the small electric type began growling angrily and its cheeks started sparking with electricity as it prepared to shock him. The endangered old man in question backed nervously away from the furious little Pokémon and sweat dropped fearfully with his hands flying up to guard his face. He clearly didn't fancy getting electrocuted, and he knew he was in the danger zone of that happening now. Apparently, Pikachu was still not overly thrilled at the idea of being captured and wanted to make the person responsible pay dearly. Ash, who by that point had recovered from his stupor of seeing the electric type, noticed the danger that Professor Oak was in and stepped between Pikachu and his teacher with his hands raised out to the sides. "Stop, Pikachu," he pleaded with a firm but earnest tone. "Don't attack the professor. He didn't capture you to be mean, he did it to stop you from chewing through the lab's power cables and stopping the flow of the electricity." Ash gritted his teeth and stared straight at the angry, sparking Pikachu with soulful brown eyes. Professor Oak has a lot of Pokémon here at the lab who depend on its power for things like healing and getting better. Even electric types like you need to sometimes absorb the lab's electrical energy when they get hurt or run low on volt power. He then lowered his arms but held them out imploringly still. I understand you're mad and upset at being captured, Pikachu, and if what I just saw when you came out was anything to go by, you obviously hate being inside of a Pokeball. I'm sorry for what happened to you, but if you need to shock somebody then shock me. Not the professor. The angry yellow Pokémon stayed in its crouched attack position, looking at Ash with narrowed eyes and with its cheeks still sparking. Right as it was about to shock him though, the electric type looked directly into the boy's eyes. What Pikachu saw there shocked it to its very core. The human standing before it had the exact same caring and compassionate look in his eyes that the one who saved him as a Pichu 5 years before did. What was more, when Pikachu really got a good look at the human before him, he began to recognize the black-haired boy. He was older than he had been all those years ago, but the electric mouse could have sworn that this human and the one who saved him were one and the same. It couldn't have been though, and he knew it because Pikachu had watched that very same boy fall to his death after saving him from falling off the cliff. He knew that, if the brave young human hadn't risked his life to save his own that day, then he was positive that he would have died with absolutely no doubt or question. Pikachu owed that human his life and had thought about him almost every day for 5 years straight. Not only did he owe Ash his life, but even the reason behind his evolution could be credited to him. When he had seen his human savior fall and plummet to the raging rapids below that day, Pikachu had become petrified with worry and fear for the boy who saved his life. He had desperately wanted to help him in some way, but he knew the only way to do that would have been to somehow catch him further downstream. Though as a Pichu, unfortunately, he simply hadn't been fast enough. Even when he had taken off running at full speed. Those very feelings of desperation and desire to save the young boy's life had been what influenced him to evolve into a Pikachu. After his evolution, which had actually occurred mid-run, the newly transformed little Pokémon had put on a burst of speed that was a last-ditch effort to get downstream and save Ash. Unfortunately, he had been too late because by the time he finally reached more level ground, his hero had completely disappeared. Pikachu had mourned for the kind and selfless human whom had saved his life. Before that day, he had been convinced that all humans were untrustworthy and never would have imagined that one of them would have actually risked and given their life for his. The stunned and confused electric type had sure that Ash had died on that horrible day, but yet, here was a person that looked and acted just like him. He was even willing to get shocked himself to save his mentor, and that alone reminded Pikachu so much of the human who had rescued him. However, in his mind, the internal debate was still raging hard at war inside of himself. By that point, Pikachu had relaxed somewhat and was simply staring hard at Ash. His cheeks were no longer sparking and his face no longer held an angry expression, but confusion and intrigue had instead taken its place. The boy himself stared right back at the electric type with an equally confused but also surprised look on his face. Why the formerly upset and aggressive Pokémon had suddenly calmed was a mystery. In fact, if he was honest with himself, the Pikachu in question perplexed him as well. It possessed the same fiery and fiercely determined gleam in its eyes as Pichu had many years before. It was only then, a few seconds after registering that thought, that he gasped aloud. It couldn't have been, and a part of his logical mind was telling him so. On the other hand though, the hopeful part of himself was speaking into his innermost desire and placing some small piece of anxious excitement that maybe, just maybe, this very Pikachu was the same one from years ago. Ash didn't know why, but it felt like an invisible force made him start stretching out his hand. He laid it upon Pikachu's head and immediately, a strong rush of energy surged between the two of them. At that same moment, a bright white glow began shining around Ash's body and surrounding both he and Pikachu. The light was so bright that Professor Oak was forced to lift up and cover his eyes from the overpowering brightness. For the two involved in the mysterious phenomenon though, neither was any the wiser. Not even as they seemingly lost consciousness and slipped into another state of reality. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX taken the time to blink. When he looked around, the young man found that he was still in the lab, only everything seemed different in some way. Perfect, in a word. Everything was still there. From the large computer monitor and workstation behind him, to the water tank machine across the room. The stairs at the far end and the storage machine that held Pokeballs was also present. The only difference was that everything seemed to have a white glow around it. The 3 Pokeballs on the machine itself were gone and the professor himself was nowhere to be found. It was then that Ash felt a tingling in his right palm and looked down at his hand. When he turned his hand around to look at it, he gasped in shock. His palm now had a strange mark on it that seemed to be alive and pulsing with the same white energy that everything in the lab now had enshrouding it. The mark itself was the purest cream in color, like milk, and had the design of a star merged as one with a beating heart inside of a circle. Ash looked at the insignia emblazoned within his very own flesh in puzzlement because he had never seen such a thing before on his hand. He could only guess that this mark was connected, in some way, with what was going on currently. He looked straight ahead then and saw Pikachu sitting in front of him on top of the Pokeball machine, just as he had been before. The small, yellow Pokémon was looking around at the familiar but somehow different surroundings and seemed just as confused as Ash about what was going on. The thing that struck the boy as the oddest though was the strange yellow energy flickering around Pikachu. It wasn't the same white and serene looking one that surrounded he and everything else around them. This particular yellow aura seemed like it embodied the very meaning of the word uncertainty. It looked wavering, nervous, unsettled and flickering. He didn't know where it came from, but Ash heard a voice in the back of his mind suddenly speak, as if a whisper, and tell him that the energy around Pikachu was representing its current emotions at the time. He didn't know if the voice was right or not, but he did know that he had to do something. They couldn't stay as they were now forever. With that, he slowly walked up to Pikachu and stared at him. The red pouch-cheeked Pokémon looked back up at him and displayed the weariness he was currently feeling. Ash just nodded and gave a soft smile, showing that everything was going to be alright as he reached out his hand, the one that had the mark on his palm, and laid it onto Pikachu's head. Again, he didn't know why he did it, but he felt it to be the right thing to do. As soon as the physical connection between the two was made, images and emotions started to pour into his mind from Pikachu. What he saw were images of its life as a Pichu, everything it did to survive in the wild, and even his meeting of a mother Kangaskhan and her baby. The former having taken him in and adopted Pikachu as her own. Ash saw fleeting glimpses of the fun times and adventures the small Pokémon had shared with his surrogate family, and it was as if he could also feel his love for the mother and child duo that had showed him such love and kindness. He also felt the electric type's bittersweet sadness when he grew big enough as a Pichu that he needed to leave the Kangaskhan and his adopted brother in order to grow and experience the world on his own. Even though he hadn't wanted to, Pikachu had simply grown to the point where he no longer fit in her pouch with her baby and knew that the time had, sadly, come to leave. Strangely, as much as he was seeing, Ash felt that he hadn't witnessed all of Pikachu's time with the mother and baby Kangaskhan, but only a small fraction of it. He also got the even stranger feeling that there were still earlier memories Pikachu had that even he didn't remember, as if repressed. Not that the confused young man had any idea how he could possibly know such things. Ash himself felt Pikachu's loneliness that he had experienced so often after leaving Kangaskhan and her baby. He also experienced, vividly, the mistrust of humans Pikachu grew to develop after seeing how some people treated and acted toward Pokémon during his time traveling throughout the region. Most of all though, the boy also felt the desire in Pikachu to become strong and powerful. To stand at the top of his species and battle fierce opponents. He could so clearly and easily see the passionate electric type's thirst to fight and defeat the strongest foes possible and to become something great. A Pokémon to be both respected and admired. His desire to be strong and powerful wasn't all because of notability and ego, however. Ash was able to feel and see, like staring into the electric type's very own heart, that Pikachu yearned to find a family for himself. Someone he could love, care for and defend. He desired to have someone special in his life that he could get strong for and protect. Much like how he had felt toward his Kangaskhan family. Which was another reason he had left. While he loved them, Pikachu knew that if he stayed, his power as a Pichu would have never grown great enough to be able to defend them adequately in the face of a serious threat. Ash also witnessed, amid Pikachu's daily travels, all the intense training that he had put himself through daily as a Pichu. Testing, pushing and straining his limits. He saw memories of the determined young Pokémon running as fast as he could in full-on sprints. He watched him use trees, rocks and other natural obstacles to improve his agility and evasiveness by running, jumping, climbing and hurdling from one point to another as quickly and smoothly as he could. Pikachu had even taught himself how to swim, and he would routinely use ponds, streams and other small bodies of water to improve his aquatic skills. But above all, Ash observed Pikachu consistently testing and pushing his electrical powers to the limit. He normally did this by using his lightning attacks on big, heavy boulders. From what the black-haired boy saw in memories and had even seen a little of himself years before after saving him, Pikachu always had been very unique during his time as a Pichu. Specifically speaking, unlike normal Pichu, he never had any issues controlling his electrical power. Because of this, Ash saw all the strong opponents that Pikachu had sought out and battled in the wild as a Pichu, and then especially after evolving. What he found most incredible though was that out of all the wild Pokémon he had challenged, never, not once, had Pikachu been defeated. Before evolving or after. That in of itself was an incredible accomplishment, since Pikachu, even as a Pichu, had battled opponents larger and stronger than himself. Raticate, Nidorino and Nidorina, Pidgeotto, Beedrill, Spearow and Fearow, Sandshrew, a Sandslash and even a particularly sour-tempered Rhyhorn once. Among others. In all honesty, Pikachu's already impressive list of victories and experience made Ash himself feel a little like he was a tad bit underachieved when stacked up next to the amazing little battle-loving mouse. The now captivated young man soon saw a memory pass by in his mind where Pikachu was standing on a tree branch and looking in through the window of a person's home. As he perched lightly upon the branch, the curious electric type stared with rapt attention at the TV that was located in the living room beyond. The program that was being watched by the homeowner was on the legendary bird trio of Kanto. When it got to Zapdos and began explaining all about its allegedly massive electrical power, even though no one was for sure, Ash felt the almost overwhelming desire and overpowering urge to become that powerful coming from Pikachu. Ash had no doubt in his mind, in that single moment alone, that this particular Pokémon in question was just as ambitious and full of spirit as he himself. The last image that played in his mind was one from before Pikachu had evolved. He had been attempting to pick and eat some berries that were hanging from a bush growing out of a cliffside. Just when he had been about to grab onto a branch, however, the ground beneath it crumbled away and he fell. Luckily, his reflexes kicked in and he managed to grab onto the edge with his paws to keep from falling into the surging river far below. As he clung to the rocky and sparsely grass-covered edge, Pichu was filled with paralyzing fear and terror, clinging to life by nothing but the small claws in his paws. Suddenly, just when he was about to give in and fall to his death, Ash felt the horror disappear from Pichu as a hand reached over the edge and pulled him up to safety. He felt the confusion, the enjoyment to be alive and the gratitude coming from the small Pokémon for the one who had saved him as his feet finally met solid ground again. Ash could sense, in that moment, Pichu's negative feelings toward humans slowly dissipate and begin to change as it looked upon its savior. Someone who was none other than a small, messy-haired boy no more than 5 years old. Just then, he felt the emotions in Pichu shift once again into fear as it began falling over the edge of the cliff once more due to the unsteady ground. However, just when he was about to plummet to his death, he was saved again by that same young boy, whom pushed him out of the way and was now falling over the edge in Pichu's stead. Ash felt the panic and horror that washed over the black and yellow electric type as he watched the human who saved his life topple down into the raging rapids below. The totally enraptured boy then felt the grief and turmoil consuming Pichu give way to a passionately committed desire to save the endangered human that was now being washed away in the powerful current. As Pichu ran with all of his speed and strength down off the cliff and rushed downstream, the anxiety and frenzied emotions flooding through his small body combined with the pure adrenaline rush, proved to be the final push he needed to ascend his current level. Before Ash's very own eyes, he watched Pichu's small body explode with bright light in the fast-paced memory. Without breaking his stride for even a moment as he ran alongside the roaring, rushing tides, the fear-driven little Pokémon's body morphed and changed as he evolved seamlessly into a Pikachu. The newly evolved electric type went as fast as his now stronger legs would take him, not even aware yet that he had evolved. The last thing Ash felt from the frantically worried little mouse was him reaching the end of the rapids, only to become consumed by crushing feelings of sadness and failure at being too late to help the human who had risked his life to save Pikachu's own. The feelings of mourning and all-consuming grief that the brave young Pokémon had felt that day almost suffocated Ash. Fortunately, it didn't last long since he was suddenly thrust out of Pikachu's thoughts, cut off from his emotions, and the blinding white light from earlier returned to send them both back into temporary unconsciousness. When Ash opened his eyes again and returned to his conscious thoughts, not even a second later, he found himself standing in Professor Oak's lab, just the way it was supposed to be and look like. No strange white glowing was to be found anywhere, and most importantly, Professor Oak was still there. Seeming as though only a brief moment had passed for him during the whole ordeal. The amber-eyed boy looked down then and found that his hand was still on Pikachu's head. The Pokémon in question was looking up at him with wide eyes. Ash himself could only guess that Pikachu had seen all of his own memories and emotions as well and was now trying to process everything he had seen. Apparently, the connection had been a two-way street. Just as he had seen glimpses of Pikachu's life through his eyes, he in turn had seen the same through his own. It could only be because of this that the small electric type was now looking at him with an expression that relayed all the many mixed feelings he was experiencing at present. Ash felt the same way with everything he himself had just seen and felt. He had no idea what it all was, or how it happened. However, in that moment, the silent young man simply didn't care. He had just found out that the Pikachu sitting before him was indeed the exact same Pichu he had saved 5 years ago. He didn't know how it was possible or what forces had brought them together again, maybe it was even Arceus herself. All Ash cared about was that he had been reunited with that same little Pokémon he bonded with in those few short moments after he had saved its life. He had a chance to get the starter Pokémon he had always wanted, and if Pikachu would accept him, there was nothing else that day that could have possibly made him happier. He soon withdrew his hand from Pikachu's head and then looked at his palm. The mark was gone now and only smooth skin remained. Ash figured that the event which had just occurred and the mark that had appeared on his palm must have truly been linked in some way. The mark itself must have only appeared because of the event that caused it, or vice versa. Either way, he decided to ponder the matter later and instead turned his attention back to Pikachu, whom was still looking at him with an unbelieving expression. Ash finally gave a small smile and spoke after a few more seconds of silence. "Wow, I can't believe you're the same Pichu from way back then. After that whole thing happened, I kept thinking about how awesome of a Pokémon you were. You had such amazing spirit and determination that I couldn't stop thinking about you. I always considered going back to the forest and finding you again, Pikachu, but I knew I couldn't." He frowned sadly at that and shook his head. "I wasn't even a trainer yet, and even if you would have wanted to come with me and be my Pokémon, I couldn't have captured you. And besides that, I thought you would have been long gone by the time I finally went back." The boy looked away for a second and then continued. "I'm really sorry that you felt so sad and guilty after I fell into that river and didn't come back. You didn't deserve to go for so long blaming yourself for what happened to me. I did what I did to save you and I don't regret it one bit. You're an awesome Pokémon, Pikachu, and I would have saved you 1,000 times over. Not a day went by you weren't on my mind. Ash finally looked back at the small electric type and smiled a little again. I'm actually starting my own Pokémon journey today. That's why I'm here, to get my first Pokémon. I've been training hard for the last 5 years and my dream is to become the greatest Pokémon master ever and train all of my future Pokémon to be the best they can be too. He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. I was supposed to either choose Squirtle, Bulbasaur or Charmander as my starter Pokémon, but, while I was supposed to be choosing one of them, I kept thinking about how awesome of a Pokémon you were. I kept wishing that you could have been the Pokémon I started with today. That's when Professor Oak went and got your Pokeball for me. The 10-year-old held his other hand out. He said I could choose you as my Pokémon if I wanted to, but I don't want you to do anything that you don't want to do. You have way too much spirit to be held down by any trainer, no matter how big their dreams may be. Ash looked down at the ground as he finished up. After seeing everything you've been through, I have way too much respect for you than to try and make you come with me if you don't want to. If you promise to not damage anything else here at the lab, I'm sure Professor Oak will release you if I ask him to. Then you'll be free again to do whatever it is you want and go wherever you want to go. I'm just happy I got to meet you again. He fell silent after that and kept looking down at the ground. Pikachu himself was shocked. Not only did he just find out that this boy was the same one who saved him all those years ago, but now that same human was putting his happiness and well-being in front of his own dream. One that he cared so much about and had trained so hard for. Pikachu had seen the human child's memories through the connection they had shared moments before, and he saw for himself just how hard Ash had trained and prepared for this very day itself. After seeing all the boy's memories and experiencing, via their earlier link, his selfless and giving nature, all the times he had put others before himself, Pikachu gained a new sense of respect and admiration for Ash. One that he never thought he could possibly feel for a human. Now this boy, the same one who had saved his life and had also apparently dreamt the last 5 years about having him as his starter Pokémon, was telling him that he would have him set free. Pikachu had never seen a human so selfless before, and in that moment, he decided. He made a decision that would forever impact both of their lives. His mind made up, he turned from Ash and looked up at Professor Oak. He then started pointing at the lightning-emblemed Pokeball that was in the old man's hand, gesturing to it while speaking quickly. Pika Pika. Chu Pika Pai Pikachu. Ash himself looked at the small Pokémon as he gestured towards his Pokeball and figured that it meant he did want to be released after all. The young man sadly nodded towards the professor, whom didn't appear the least bit fazed at the strange light show he had seen earlier. Almost as if the event had somehow been wiped from his memory and he had instead simply been watching Ash and Pikachu interact together the whole time. The older man looked down at the Pikachu asking for its Pokeball and then back up at his student. Seeing him give the okay, the professor felt great sympathy but also pride in the boy before nodding in return. He knew his surrogate grandson was selfless, but to give up the Pokémon he had wanted as his starter for 5 years, purely for Pikachu's happiness, was something truly admirable in his eyes. Of course, he had no idea how his student could possibly know that this particular Pikachu was the same Pichu he had met years before. But, one thing he had learned in all of his years studying the relationships between people and Pokémon was that when a bond formed between them, sometimes the most amazing and even unexplainable things could happen. In his opinion, simply recognizing one another, even after years of separation, did not seem to be beyond the reason of explanation. If Ash and Pikachu had really formed such a bond the first time they met, he did not find it unbelievable at all that they would recognize each other. Whether long years had parted them for a time or not. While he would indeed be the first to call it a miracle that he had just so happened to capture, earlier that morning, the very first Pokémon his student had ever formed a bond with, the kind-hearted professor only wished that it could have ended the way he knew Ash was longing for. He himself felt a great desire that, if only he could have provided his surrogate grandson this last birthday gift, he would have been content. Though alas, fate was not always so kind. Even still, it was a test of the boy's mettle that he could have what he had so yearned for being dangled before his face, only to make the selfless decision to let it go. With a frown of sadness on his face, Oak walked up and handed Pikachu his Pokeball. Both he and Ash fully expected for the lightning-natured Pokémon to throw it away in order to show that he wanted to be released. Instead, however, Pikachu did something that utterly stunned both of them. He took his Pokeball and turned to the black-haired boy, pushing the ball towards him. Ash himself looked confused at first but took the Pokeball out of the electric type's outstretched paws regardless. After he did, Pikachu smiled and then, in one impressive and accurate leap, jumped over onto the boy's left shoulder from the machine. He himself was dumbfounded concerning what the diminutive Pokémon had wanted for a moment, but then realization finally hit him. Pikachu must have wanted to come with him and be his first Pokémon after all. There simply couldn't have been another explanation. Knowing this, Ash appeared as though he could burst from sheer happiness at any moment, but he wanted to be sure that it was what Pikachu wanted first. Thus, he turned his head to look at the Pokémon up on his shoulder and asked, "Pikachu, are you sure you want to come with me and be my Pokémon?" The small little rodent nodded and then squeaked happily in assent. "Hi Pikachu." At that, he simply couldn't hold it anymore and Ash let out a loud cheer in excitement. He then lifted Pikachu off his shoulder and spun him around quickly in celebration before coming to a stop before either one could get too dizzy. Soon after, he put the yellow and brown striped Pokémon back on his shoulder and looked up at him while smiling. "I know you want to become the most powerful Pokémon you can be, Pikachu, I felt it. And I want to be the greatest Pokémon master I can possibly become. If we're gonna be the best, then we're also gonna have to train as hard as we can. I intend to help make you the strongest Pikachu there's ever been, but I need to know if you're ready for it. What do you say, buddy?" Ash's new and first Pokémon looked down at him seriously and then put his paw in the air, a determined look on his fuzzy face. "Pika. Hi Pikachu Chew Pie." He saw the fire in the electrical mouse's dark eyes and could hear the passion in his voice and knew right then that Pikachu would be ready to train as hard as possible to achieve both of their goals. The proud young man felt confident in that moment that he couldn't possibly have picked a better starter Pokémon and was overjoyed to have the short electric type finally by his side. Professor Oak had been watching all of it from off to the side and was amazed, once more, at Ash's way with Pokémon. It truly was an amazing sight to see indeed. Soon enough, he stepped up to the newly formed duo and spoke. "Well Ash, my boy, it seems you are all ready to head out on your journey now." He looked at his teacher and nodded. "Yeah, me and Pikachu better head out so we can get a good start on the day." The angular-faced professor smiled. "That sounds like a good plan, Ash. Though you still have plenty of time left in the day, I believe it is only right at about 8 presently. Make sure you take time to enjoy the sights with your Pokémon and don't just speed through your travels. The slower you go, the more likely you are to see something rare and spectacular." The middle-aged man's smile became a little strained and exasperated. "Gary is going on his own journey in a car with some friends. Myself and Amelia tried to talk him into walking so he could enjoy the experience with his Pokémon, but he won't listen. So, in short, just take your time, Ash. You'll be happy you did, trust me." The boy smiled and nodded at the professor's tested words of wisdom and decided that he would do just that, take his time. He wasn't going to rush through his journey and miss anything, he wanted to see it all. And besides, he knew that he would have to stop plenty enough as it was so he could train his Pokémon. Why not enjoy the sights along the way? After that, Oak started speaking again and gained his pupil's attention. "Before you go though, why don't you get used to using that Pokédex and scan Pikachu with it?" Seeing the merit behind the intelligent elder man's suggestion, Ash reached toward the clip at his left side for the Pokédex. Meanwhile, Pikachu freely hopped back down onto the Pokeball machine so that his new trainer could better do whatever it was he intended. Ash then pointed it at the electric-loving Pokémon and after pressing the button on the top right corner, it slid straight up and the bottom and top screen came to life. An image of Pikachu soon showed up on the top one after the quick scan was finished, and then the device began giving out the young electric-type species-specific information. Pokédex entry number 025. Pikachu, the mouse Pokémon. Pikachu that can generate powerful electricity have cheek sacs that are very soft and quite stretchy. When Pikachu meet, they will touch their tails together and exchange electricity through them as a form of greeting. This Pikachu is male and has the abilities Static and Lightning Rod. This Pokémon knows the following moves: Tackle, Tail Whip, Thunder Shock, Thunder Wave and Thunderbolt. The spiky, messy-haired boy whistled in amazement. That was a very impressive move set indeed for a Pokémon that didn't possess any prior official training with an actual trainer, aside from what he did on his own. The fact that Pikachu had two abilities instead of the usual one made him even more unique and impressive as well. Ash knew that his first Pokémon was special, and the information Dexter had just given him proved that fact even more so. He soon put his Pokédex away, and then Pikachu jumped onto his shoulder as he turned back to face Professor Oak. "Well, Professor, I guess this is it. Thank you so much for everything you taught me and for all the great gifts you gave me today. I really do appreciate it." The older man smiled at his grandson in all but blood. "It was my pleasure, Ash. You earned everything that you received today. You have learned so much from me these last 5 years, and I am very proud of you for showing such dedication. I know you are going to do great things. Just remember that when you want to come home, Pallet will always be here. Your mother, as well as myself and Amelia, will be glad to have you back." At that, the gray-haired man stopped for a moment and held up his finger. "Ah yes, that reminds me, here." He then reached into his right Tanpants pocket and produced 5 empty, shrunken-down Pokeballs. The 5 standard Pokeballs to start your journey with, use them wisely. Smiling in gratitude, the boy reached out and took them before attaching the 5 empty balls onto the cloth belt wrapped around his waist. Afterward, he looked back at his teacher and nodded. "Thanks, Professor. Mom actually went to the Pokemart in Viridian about a week ago while I was here studying and bought a bunch of the supplies she couldn't get here. I have 20 extra Pokeballs in my pack right now." Professor Oak chuckled and rubbed his chin. "Yes, well, now you can add a few more to the list before you'll need to make a run for more." The polite young man smiled at the kind older man and replied earnestly. "Thanks, Professor, and don't worry. I'll call you and Mom on my X-transceiver once I get to Viridian City. It probably won't be for a week or 2 though. Pikachu and I are gonna camp out on Route 1 for a while and really get to some hard training in order to prepare ourselves. It'll be good for bonding too." The wizened and learned professor nodded at that and then walked up to Ash and Pikachu. "Well, I wish you both the best of luck on your journey. I would walk you down to the road, but I need to wait here for the others to arrive. Take care of yourself, Ash. I look forward to hearing from you at Viridian." After saying their farewells, Ash made his way back out into the main area of the lab and allowed Professor Oak to see him off at the front door. From there, he walked down the long stone steps to the gate at the bottom of the hill. However, as soon as he arrived, a sight awaited him that made him stop at first, but soon, he smiled brightly. Gathered as if to give a big send-off celebration was Delia, Amelia and several of the people from both the neighborhood and town that Ash knew growing up. All of them were smiling and waving at him while a few cheered and others still held up signs of support with his name on them. There was even a big banner with large words scrawled across it that read, "Good luck, Ash. We're rooting for you." Reaching the small group of neighbors, friends and supporters, Ash looked at all of them before settling his gaze on his mother, whom was smiling proudly at her son. "Wow, Mom. What's with the big send-off party?" The brunette gestured at all the people behind her and gave a soft laugh of amusement. "After you left to get your first Pokémon, Amelia and I decided to get all the neighbors together and celebrate the start of your journey. They're also here to wish Gary well when he arrives." Amelia smiled at her nephew. "Yeah, you didn't think we'd let you just slip off, did you, kiddo?" Ash's smile grew hearing that, and his heart warmed as everyone else started giving him kind words of well-wishing support. "We believe in you, Ash. Yeah, go knock 'em dead, kid. Put Pallet Town on the map for us, Ash. You're gonna be a great Pokémon trainer." Make us all proud, Ash. Looking amongst all the faces, he recognized quite a few. Like Mrs. Hirakichido, the slightly heavy-set and sweet older lady whom he used to garden for and assist in yard work during the summer for a few extra credits. She was known as the cat lady of Palette, since her entire home was absolutely full of Meowth and Persian. Still, somehow, she managed to keep it spotlessly clean, and from his days working for her or visiting, Ash knew it was because all the woman ever did was either clean or bake. He also saw Mr. Suzumo Suzuki in attendance. He was a kindly and short older man that was bald on the top but had stark white hair around the sides of his head. He wore big, thick glasses that made it impossible to see his eyes, and he always had on the same blue jean overalls, green undershirt and brown loafers every day of the year. It was a running joke among most of the people in Palette that he had a closet at home full of the same outfit. Mr. Suzuki owned the grocery store in town that everyone shopped at, and his mother had also worked there when she was younger. He was a nice man but a tad forgetful and senile at times due to his age. There was also the totally white and wild-haired older man, Nariah Arrow, whom was simply known by everyone in Palette as Uncle Nariah. He was a fun-loving, excitable and good-hearted older man, perhaps in his early 50s, who ran a small home repair business. He usually wore old jeans and shirts of various colors, but since he was a carpenter and repairman, they were almost always dirty, ripped up or sloshed with paint stains. Nariah was a tall man, and since his job was so physical, he was still in good shape, even for a man his age. Ash and his mother knew him because he routinely came and fixed anything, big or small, that broke around the house, and always did so for nothing but a home-cooked meal in return. He and his father had also been pretty good friends too, from what Ash understood. The reason he was known as Uncle Nariah was because almost all the kids in town loved him. He was a bit of a charmer who loved to harmlessly flirt with any woman, young or old, that he could, but since he was never crass or crossed any lines, he was mostly seen as a harmless, funny jokester. Ash himself loved it every time he came around because Nariah would always make it a point to say or do something humorous that made he and his mother laugh. He also shared funny stories of the things he and Richard got into when they were younger, and Ash always enjoyed hearing those. He also saw that Miss Haishu had decided to come. She was a teacher at Palette Primary School in town, and during the 5 years that he studied under Professor Oak, she would occasionally come by and be his teacher for a day or two whenever the professor was either busy with important research or away on business. She was a black-haired lady that wore it in a tight, high bun atop her head at all times. It had a few gray streaks in it, but not a lot. She had a stern, angular face with sharp dark eyes and wore glasses right on the bridge of her nose. She almost always wore the same dark schoolteacher suit, and it most definitely completed her look as a strict, disciplined, middle-aged teacher. While she was indeed stern, Miss Kima Haishu was also fair and could be kind if the ones she was dealing with were nice, respectful, and tried to do everything to the best of their ability. She respected determination, and since Ash had always been a passionate child committed to learning, they both had an amicable relationship. Beside the schoolteacher was her twin sister, Miss Kita Haishu. She ran the Palette Town Library, and when it came to stern discipline, she and her sister were as identical in it as they were in appearance. They even wore the same business suit attire, hairstyle and glasses combination. The only difference was that while Mrs. Kima's suit was dark, Kita's own was tan. The dark-haired librarian ran her precious library like an officer did their precinct, and she loved books more than anything. Because of this, she demanded the utmost respect and politeness when in her library. Fortunately, since Ash had a love of books and also met both of the prior personality requirements, he was on the same friendly terms with Miss Kita as he was her twin sibling. There were some days that he could spend hours in total silence reading in the library, and since he never returned any book late, Miss Kita more than once said he was her favorite patron. Seeing all of his favorite people gathered to send him off, as well as many others that he knew in passing but were still always kind to he and his mother, the messy-haired boy smiled joyfully. "Wow, everybody. I can't thank you enough for showing up like this, it really means a lot to me. I mean it, thank you. Ah ha ha. Uncle Naraya stepped forward and wrapped an arm around his shoulders, grinning from ear to ear on his slightly stubbled face. Well, of course we had to see you off, kid. It's your birthday and you're starting out on your very own journey today. That means you're gonna meet all kinds of beautiful women. He raised his fist as rivers of tears fell from his eyes in torrents. I'm so jealous. The Haishu sisters cleared their throats and gave the wild-spirited, lady-loving older man a stern glare. Having been on the wrong side of their sharp tongues in the past when he made the mistake of flirting with them, Naraya immediately started to sweat nervously and backed away while placatingly holding his hands up. Hey, I'm just kidding, come on. You know me. I didn't mean it. Although he quickly leaned in and whispered to Ash. Hey kid, make sure ya tell me about all the pretty ladies you meet on your travels when you come back. The 10-year-old in question cracked a small smile but nodded regardless as Naraya shot him a toothy grin, gave a thumbs up and then stepped back into the crowd after wishing him good luck and a happy birthday. The Haishu sisters came next as the slightly older one, Kima, went first in her brisk tone. Well, Mr. Ketchum, today is your birthday and also begins your Pokémon journey. I will wish you well for both, and as a parting gift, I shall give you these words of wisdom. She raised her finger in a way that the prim and proper older lady always did when teaching. Education and keeping your mind open to learning new things will serve you better on your journey than anything else. A mind open to learning all you can will ensure that the challenges you face never overwhelm you. An educated mind makes for a successful venture. Ash nodded politely to her words of wisdom and thanked her for it before turning to Kita, whom folded her hands behind her back as she looked down her glasses at him. I will add to what my sister has so wisely said, young man. And that is this: books are your best friend, and if you wish to become a true Pokémon master, never neglect what they have to teach you. Also, if you visit any libraries on your travels, treat them with the same respect you have given mine. A thin smile came across her lips. Happy birthday, Mr. Ketchum. I look forward to seeing my best patron again. Delia's son did likewise and thanked her as well just before Mrs. Kichido came up and gave him one of her famous, bone-crushing hugs. Oh little Ash, I'm going to miss you and your visits to see me. I do so enjoy them. As the curly, dark-haired and stocky woman hugged the boy and swung him around, Ash's face was buried straight between the older lady's sizable cleavage. His nose was pressed into the dark purple fabric of the classy dress she always wore, and the strong-smelling perfume Mrs. Kichido seemed to all but bathe and almost overwhelmed the poor boy's senses. Not to mention made him want to retch. I'll tell all of the kiddies back home that you said goodbye, and as soon as you return I'm going to bake one of those lemon tart pies you love so much. Oh my dear sweet boy, I'm going to miss you so much. Happy birthday and best of luck on your journey. Even as Ash felt the sweet bliss of unconsciousness trying to pull at his senses due to lack of air, which would have been a sweet release just to escape the prison of sickeningly sweet perfume he was trapped in, it was worse for Pikachu. The small electric type was also suffering alongside his new trainer, since Mrs. Kichido's ursine hug had pulled him down off of Ash's shoulder and straight between her large bosom. At present, all that could be seen of him was his yellow and dark-tipped ears sticking out above her arms and Ash's messy dark locks. Luckily, before he could lose his patience and shock both Ash and the overzealous cat lady, she let them go. As soon as she did, the almost blue-faced boy stumbled back while limply holding Pikachu in his arms. Both were panting and trying to take in gasps of fresh air to cleanse their sinuses of the noxious perfume vapors that were still lingering after the deathly embrace. Thanks. Mrs. K. Kichido. Ash gasped back as he slowly felt his full awareness returning and his legs regaining strength. The air was beginning to clear for him and his face was losing the purple hue it had began to form from lack of oxygen. I'll make sure to visit when I come back, he promised with a weak smile and thumbs up while Pikachu still panted softly in his arms and shot the hefty woman an unappreciative glare. He wasn't too thrilled at all with the sudden and very unexpected assault that had occurred on both his physical well-being and sensitive olfactory passages. Even now he could smell the nasty perfume on his fur and could tell that it would take days to lick it out. Still, He and Ash were both internally suffering since the latter had to entertain the thought of eating one of Mrs. Kichido's disgusting lemon pies when he returned home. Nasty, horribly tart-tasting things that, for some reason, she was convinced he loved. Even though he had never given any prior indication to support such an assumption. After the husky older woman stepped back while wiping her eyes and blowing her nose with a purple handkerchief, her favorite color, Mr. Suzuki hobbled forward in the bent-forward position he was known for. Then, hands clasped behind his back, he looked at the young man and spoke in his higher-pitched, aged tone. "Well, young'un, I suppose today's the day you finally set out for the police academy." His senility getting the best of him, Mr. Suzuki started to ramble on without giving much stock to what he was saying. "I remember when I was your age and I wanted to get into the grocer business. My, that was a year for it. Darn bug types ate up all the farmer's grain that year 'cause of the famine and we had to make do with nothin' but an old box of barley ears and a couple heads of cabbage. I sold them all for 2.5 credits apiece and then we had to start sellin' old potato whiskey. Yes sir, I tell ya it was." As the flighty old man continued to ramble mindlessly, Delia smiled in soft amusement at her old employer and then walked up to her son, whom was too polite to interrupt the elderly grocer but desperately appeared to be in need of a rescue. Even Pikachu didn't understand the old human's mindless musings since he was listening with an ear cocked to the side in confusion from back atop Ash's shoulder. "So honey, is this your first Pokémon?" she asked as she looked at the small electric mouse in curious intrigue. "Yeah, sure is." Ash looked up at Pikachu on his shoulder and smiled. "This is my mom Pikachu, say hi." The mouse Pokémon looked at Delia and smiled as he chirped a cheerful, "Pika." In reply. This caused both Delia and Amelia to squeal like giddy schoolgirls at the sheer adorableness of the small electric type. "Aw, he's so cute." Delia went to reach for him but her son held his hands up. "Whoa mom, hold up. Pikachu can be a little temperamental with people it doesn't know and he could shock you." Delia stopped for a moment and blinked before just leaving her palm out toward Pikachu for him to sniff. The electric mouse slowly leaned forward and sniffed her hand for a few seconds before pulling back and smiling. Then, with a chirp, he leapt from Ash's shoulder and into Delia's arms. "Hi Pikachu." At that, Ash blinked in surprise but smiled nonetheless while Delia scratched Pikachu behind the ears and cooed to him. "You're just so cute and adorable Pikachu." Amelia, following her friend's example, reached her hand out and allowed her nephew's first Pokémon to sniff it. Apparently receiving the same acceptance as Delia, Pikachu pushed his head into her hand and allowed Professor Oak's daughter to scratch his cheeks. "He's so soft. Especially his cute little cheek pouches, they feel like silk." Both mothers fawned over Pikachu for a few seconds before the older one looked at Ash and asked curiously. "One question though, how did you end up with a Pikachu as your Pokémon? I may not be a trainer myself but having a dad as a researcher, I know what the regional starters are. I don't recall a Pikachu ever being on the list." The boy smiled as Pikachu jumped back onto his shoulder after receiving enough attention. "Well, I did try to pick one of the original 3 first but I just couldn't." He then looked up at Pikachu. "When I was 5 I met a little Pichu in the woods outside of the ranch. We bonded and ever since then I kept wishing that I could have had it as my starter. When I went to the lab today to choose my first Pokémon, Professor Oak showed me Pikachu when I couldn't decide. We both recognized each other and I knew right then and there that it had to be him." Delia, Amelia and the small crowd behind them all smiled softly as they heard the short story, feeling touched at the heartwarming tale of such a special reunion. "Well, you two look wonderful together honey," Delia complimented sincerely. "You just fit with Pikachu on your shoulder like that." Amelia nodded in agreement, along with Mr. Suzuko, whose senior moment had finally passed, as well as Mrs. Kichido, Uncle Jiraiya and even the stern Haishu sisters. "I agree," Gary's mother nodded. "You made a good choice Ash. That little Pikachu sure would make a good mascot at the store." Mr. Suzuko complimented with a smile that showed his pearly false teeth. "Oh dear." Mrs. Kichido clapped her hands together at her cheeks. "Why he's almost as adorable as my Meowth and Persian at home." If it wouldn't be a mouse in a house full of cats, then I think I'd like to have a Pikachu myself now. Kima and Kita both looked down at the boy and Pokémon duo at the same time, the strict middle-aged ladies peering through their spectacles at them. Well, I must say, Kima began. You both hold yourselves with a dignified demeanor and respectful dignity. Her younger sister by mere minutes, Kita, continued. I am in agreement that you fit well together. You make quite the... They both finished the last bit together in the way most twins did. Distinguished pair. At that, Naraya gave them both a thumbs up and grinned. Hey, I like it. With that cool Pikachu there, you shouldn't have any problem attracting the ladies' kid. The stern sisters shot a glare at the innocently perverted repairman, and he immediately lunged back while stuttering. Kidding. I'm kidding, of course. Ash and Pikachu both shared an amused look between them before the boy's attention was pulled back to his mother. Ash, you make sure to be careful out there, okay? You and Pikachu look out for one another and don't forget to eat breakfast, lunch and dinner. She then held up a finger. Also, don't forget to do your laundry, wash your dishes, brush your teeth, always say please and thank you. Don't borrow money you can't pay back. Remember your table manners, always be a gentleman and make sure to change your underwear every day. Ash, whom had been sweat dropping and smiling nervously as his mother went on, turned red when she went to bring up the great taboo in front of everyone, but, thankfully, Amelia came to his rescue. I think he's got the point, Del. She quickly pulled her friend back. Ash is a responsible young man and he won't forget to take care of himself. He'll be fine. She then turned her own gaze on her nephew and smiled softly at him. But your mom is right, Ash, just be careful and have fun on your journey. Remember too that this will always be your home and we'll all be here rooting you and Gary on every second of the way. Ash looked around and saw his mother, Mr. Suzuko, Mrs. Kichido, Naraya and the Haishu sisters, as well as everyone else, all smile and nod in agreement. Feeling his belly grow warm at the knowledge that he had such supportive friends and family waiting for him at home caused Ash himself to smile as well. Thank you, everyone, thank you so much. I'm going to do all I can to make you all proud, I promise. Delia stepped forward and hugged her son tightly. You've already made me proud, Ash, and I know your father would be too. Hearing that caused his eyes to grow a little moist and he grasped onto his mother tightly, hugging her and breathing in her scent since he knew it would be a while before he saw her again. Delia herself became a little wet in the eyes as they hugged, and when they finally separated a short time later, she quickly wiped her eyes and her son did the same. Afterwards, Amelia moved in to give her nephew a firm hug as well. Good luck, Ash, I know you and Gary will do great. The birthday boy even received a hug from Mr. Suzuko, Mrs. Kichido, a hearty one from Naraya, and the Haishu twins surprisingly also gave him one. Once he was done saying his goodbyes, Ash hoisted his backpack up onto his shoulders more evenly and smiled at everyone. Alright, thanks again everybody. We're heading out now, see you all later. With that said, he turned and began heading toward the bridge that lead across the river and to the main road. As they went, he and Pikachu looked over their shoulders and waved. The small group back at the gate waved in return and, in tandem, they all said together, Happy birthday, Ash. Good luck. His mother was the last one to say something though, as she cupped her hands over her cheeks and yelled, Goodbye, Ash. I love you, honey. Please look out for him, Pikachu. The small electric type eye smiled and called back to his trainer's mother. Pikachu. With their final parting being said, the newly minted duo crossed the slightly arched and quaint little bridge and stepped onto the main road, leaving the small group of supportive neighbors and friends behind to give a send-off to Gary as well. However, they were only on the road for a short time before Ash and Pikachu saw a red convertible speeding down the road toward them with a car full of people. Ash stepped onto the roadside and waited for the car to pass, but when it got close enough, the vehicle stopped right beside of him. To his surprise, he saw that it was none other than Gary sitting in the back of the sports car on the rich, tan leather seat. The grandson of Professor Oak was surrounded by a group of young women that all looked to be in their late teens, and by the way they were dressed, they were most likely wealthy. The convertible itself was being driven by another young woman with dark hair and sunglasses. As soon as the car came to a stop and he saw who was standing on the side of the road, Gary gave a condescending sneer and sat up on the back of the seat. "Hey there, if it isn't Ashy boy. Did you forget where the lab is? It's back that way, loser." Even though he knew that his one-time childhood friend was just trying to get a rise out of him, the raven-haired rookie trainer refused to give in to it. "Hey Gary. You better get up there or else the other two kids might show up and take the Pokémon you want." The older boy snorted. "Yeah, maybe. But it wouldn't mean anything to me. No matter what Pokémon I pick, I'll still be a great trainer either way. It's you that should worry, Ashy boy. You're gonna need as much help as you can get. Maybe if you ask nicely, I'll leave you a decent Pokémon." Ash just smirked and then thumbed up at Pikachu on his shoulder. "No thanks, Gary. I already have my first Pokémon. Say hi to Pikachu." The spunky little electric type sounded off from his perch. "Pika." His trainer just shrugged. "Actually, I already have my Pokédex and everything else ready to go. Me and Pikachu were just heading for Route 1. Maybe if you had been here earlier you could have gotten your Pokémon and Pokédex before me. But oh well, some people need their sleep, right Gary?" The snide young man looked irritated but managed to hide it. "Yeah, well, you're still just a loser, Ashy boy, and I guess I'll have to remind you of that someday soon when we have our first battle. Of course, I recommend you train that little rodent of yours up before you even think about challenging me." Ash merely shrugged again, not worried or concerned about him in the least. "I guess we'll find out who's better when we battle, won't we? Take care of yourself, Gary, and choose your first Pokémon wisely." With that said, he began to walk away down the road again. However, after a few steps he stopped and then looked back at the other boy with an unnervingly intense gleam in his eyes. "Oh, and Gary, never call my Pikachu a rodent again." The brown-haired boy felt himself become slightly taken aback as he stared into Ash's firm gaze and felt a little uneasy at the hardness in his tone. However, he hid his unease well with a smirk and flipped his hair up. "Whatever. Smell y'all later, loser." With that, Gary gave the order and the woman driving the car took off down the road toward Professor Oak's lab. Ash, for his part, just shook his head at the other boy's immaturity and then looked up at Pikachu. "You ready to go, buddy?" The enthusiastic little Pokémon nodded excitedly and raised his fist. "Pie Pika pie." With that said, the two of them turned their backs on Pallet Town and set off for Route 1 in the first leg of their journey. The sun was starting to shine brightly and the wind was blowing a pleasant breeze through the air. It was a perfect day to begin an important and life-changing journey. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX back and forth joyfully and sharing laughs about anything that presented itself as humorous. Eventually, they came to a part of the area they were in that was covered by miles of field and sparsely placed trees on both sides of the road. Seeing this, Ash stopped and looked around, taking everything in as an assessment of their current surroundings. Apparently liking what he found, the young man suddenly veered off the path and walked into the field on the left side of the road. Since it was late June, the days were hot and there wasn't a lot of rain. The grass in the field was pretty brown and parched, and Ash nodded in approval as he continued walking through the field. Pikachu seemed confused though as to why his trainer was seemingly traipsing about needlessly off the main road and spoke on it. "Pika Pi Pikachu." He looked up at the Pokémon on his shoulder and answered his question. "We're looking for a good spot to pitch camp and train for a week or two. I really want you to have a power advantage over Pokémon who are at your level right now, and I also want you to be the strongest on the team we're gonna build. That way they have someone to look up to in terms of strength and skill." He held a finger up and smiled. "Doing that will let them see the results of hard training. This field seemed promising and I wanted a closer inspection of the area before deciding. It's wide open and that means we have plenty of room to work on your speed. Now, if I can just find a few other things we need for your training, then this field will work perfectly for us." Pikachu appeared excited at the mention of training and getting stronger and nodded eagerly. Ash eventually came to a spot in the field that was about 100 yards away from the road. The location itself was perfect. It was right next to a large stream that they could use for drinking water, and plus, the current was moving fast enough and was just deep enough that it would allow for training in the water perfectly. There was a small area right near the stream that was shaded by trees, and Ash decided to use it for the campsite. Some distance away was a large cluster of rocks and boulders that he knew would be perfect for training Pikachu's agility, strength, power, accuracy, and physical moves, as well as to work on his electric-type attacks. Pikachu's Volt Power, as Ash liked to call an electric Pokémon's ability to use electricity, was something he endeavored to fiercely train his newfound partner in. Overall, the bright young man liked what he found and decided to make permanent camp. He then headed over to where the campsite was going to be laid out amongst the tree cluster and started setting everything up. Demonstrating the skills he had learned from his mother and that Uncle Nariah had helped him to refine, he pitched the tent, made a small fire pit, and gathered a healthy supply of firewood from a patch of sparse woodland nearby. Once he was done constructing his campsite, Ash stood back and admired his work. He smiled approvingly after a few seconds of observation and then set to work making he and Pikachu lunch. He cooked his usual healthy meal for himself, which consisted of some dried meat, veggies and fruit. All storage and travel-safe foods that his mother had packed for him in hearty quantities to last a while. For Pikachu, Ash had decided to set him up on a special diet. The food itself was healthy and had several great benefits for the small electric type in it. The greatest of which would help to increase the Pikachu's power. The boy added a few supplements and herbs to the mix while he was preparing the food over the fire, which supported growth in strength, power, speed, endurance and many other attributes that he felt would benefit Pikachu's overall health and growth. The messy-haired trainer also took out the necessary ingredients and utensils from his bag that he needed and made a few poffins that would provide Pikachu's pelt with a glossy and healthier sheen. Mostly, they were for the outward appearance, but they still held a few good health qualities as well. While it would take time to establish a recipe and meal plan for Pikachu that was just right for him, Ash knew that trial and error would eventually bring one about. He also needed some actual Pokémon food mix that was exclusively for electric types, but that would have to come only when they reached Viridian City and could resupply. Once they were done with lunch, Pikachu had indeed enjoyed his food. Ash explained to him their training routine. Pikachu would first work on his overall speed by running through the massive field as fast and for as long as he could. That would help him to learn the move Quick Attack much faster. Then, once he finally learned the aforementioned move, he would blitz through the field using nothing but it in order to the utmost limits of his endurance. This method would assure that Pikachu's Quick Attack would keep getting faster. It would also help his training in 3 other areas. Namely, his base speed would greatly improve, his stamina and endurance would also strengthen drastically, and, through all of that speed training, Pikachu might even become a candidate to someday learn a move that only the fastest of Pokémon could attain: extreme speed. Ash had read all about it and knew that extreme speed was one of the most powerful speed attacks a Pokémon could learn. It relied completely on one's sheer speed and power, most especially speed. He knew that Pikachu could learn the move, but it would take quite some time to do so, and the first thing to learn as a stepping stone was Quick Attack. However, that would take nothing but a lot of time and intense training. After the first phase of training, Pikachu would then hit the river and work on swimming drills for an hour so that he could build his muscle strength, speed, and stamina all at the same time. Of course, as with all of his running and sprinting drills in the field beforehand, Ash made his first Pokémon wear one of the body weights that Professor Oak had given him. It wasn't overwhelmingly heavy yet, quite naturally, since Pikachu was just starting out on his integrated, intense training regimen. Although, it was still quite heavy, and after Ash had pulled the weight out of the travel case they were in, enlarged it and figured out how to strap it to his Pokémon, Pikachu spent some time just learning how to move properly in it. Once he was done with aquatics, the fiery little electric type would then go to the Rock Hollow, as Ash dubbed the rocky part of the field that had huge boulders and rocks strewn everywhere in it, and work on several things. He would first have him work on his agility by running as fast as he could while weaving in and out through the large rocks and boulders. He did all of this while Ash stood outside and threw rocks at him, making Pikachu dodge as many of them as he could. He would do this type of multifaceted training down on the ground and up on top of the rocks in order to work on learning both of the moves, agility and double team. Pikachu would then harshly drill on his physical and fighting-based moves. He did so by performing brutal routines like smashing his head into the large boulders using tackle. This was to the effect that he would be able to upgrade tackle for the more powerful headbutt attack. Pikachu would also mercilessly strike his tail on the same giant rocks, attempting to shatter them. This method of training would, hopefully, allow him to learn Iron Tail at some point. He would also drill gruelingly on fighting and combat drills using the biggest boulders as sparring dummies, all while executing an array of different punching and kicking combinations on Ash's command. This type of training embodied the dual purpose of hardening and strengthening Pikachu's small body while at the same time helping him to eventually learn fighting type and combat-natured moves, such as Mega Punch, Mega Kick, Reversal, Thunder Punch and Body Slam. Once all of that was done, Richard's son would then have the evolved form of Pichu work on increasing and strengthening his electrical attacks, as well as training to overcome his type disadvantages at the same time. Pikachu would work on strengthening his volt power and addressing his type weaknesses by striking some of the many sizable rocks in the hollow, and even the very ground itself, with attacks like Thunderbolt. He would hit the aforementioned boulders and the rocky, solid earth using his electric attacks for as long as he possibly could and with as much power as he could muster. In doing so, he would only stop when on the verge of passing out. His trainer had explained to him that, since electric types possessed such woeful disadvantages against rock and ground type Pokémon, he wanted Pikachu to work on increasing his electrical power until he could break rock and leave craters in the ground itself utilizing only the power of lightning. Ash explained to his first Pokémon that this type of training, though exceedingly hard and difficult, would yield the benefits of not only making Pikachu's volt power much more powerful and overwhelming in sheer force, it would also make his electric attacks strong against any of the other types that his species were weak against, which would thereby translate into one nasty surprise for any trainer they faced that used rock or ground type Pokémon. Moreover, training in such a way could very potentially unlock 3 of Pikachu's strongest electric type moves, those being Volt Tackle, Electro Ball and Thunder. Granted, it would probably take time to do so, but Ash felt confident Pikachu would eventually learn all of those moves if they just stayed dedicated to that particular type of training. At first, Pikachu seemed confused as to how it was supposed to break solid rock and crater the ground with nothing but its electric type attacks, but Ash explained to him a new method he had devised in using electrical attacks. He had explained to his new Pokémon that the way to succeed in destroying boulders and carving chunks out of the ground with his electricity was to condense and increase the amps and density threshold of his inner voltage before releasing it. Focusing all of his power and strength into creating solid mass with his lighting, instead of loose and widespread arcs, would ensure a much more destructive impact ratio than normal electric type attacks. Dense and sturdy objects, like rocks or even the ground itself, were hard and rigid elements. Naturally, it would take a greater force to cause them damage. Condensing and amplifying the strike force and overall raw power output of a lightning bolt would help facilitate the endeavor of being able to overcome the resistance barrier provided by a heavy boulder or the ground itself before they finally gave in and broke. Ash had decided to call this new form of utilizing electrical power, focused lightning. And the possibilities were quite literally limitless. This revolutionary type of training that only Pikachu and other electric-type Pokémon could do would very possibly make them one of the most powerful types in the world. If one were to master the concept of focused lightning, it could give electric types a strong advantage against any type they were weak to, since they could just use this new method of electrical discharge and overcome any defense or typing with just sheer power alone. Namely, in the form of extremely powerful, highly supercharged and greatly condensed bolts of thunder. In many ways it would be like a real thunderbolt dropping from the sky. Natural lightning strikes could actually shatter rock and even crater the ground, so in Ash's mind, why couldn't an electric-type Pokémon do the same thing with their own power? The training required to master the aforementioned technique would be extremely hard of course, but he looked at it as being worth it. And he knew that Pikachu could do it. He had also explained to his first Pokémon that, when he finally learned how to use this new type of electrical power, he would have to go easy on almost any Pokémon he used it on. Regardless of whether it was a type that Pikachu was strong or weak against, he had to be careful. Otherwise, he could seriously hurt his opponents. Pikachu obviously understood and agreed. He wanted to be powerful, but he did not want to purposefully hurt another Pokémon. The two of them had decided that, eventually, when he was strong enough, they would take focused lightning and adapt it to the next level by applying the same concept to Steel-type Pokémon. However, that would have to come later, much later, and only once Pikachu became far stronger. If he was ever going to be able to punch holes through solid steel with nothing but electricity, then he was going to need an overwhelming amount of volt power in his body. Plus, he would also have to be able to perfectly channel all of that raw energy and power with masterful skill. Something that was simply beyond his current level. Ash contemplated for a short time on whether or not the new type of training he was developing could work with other types of Pokémon as well. He could only imagine the possibilities and doors that such a thing could open for him as a trainer and for the future Pokémon he captured and trained. Unfortunately, only time would tell. Of course, Ash himself was no slacker at all. It was training time for Pikachu and for himself as well. Every day while the determined and spirited electric type would do his training, his trainer did his own. And just like Pikachu, he also wore one of the weighted body suits that were specifically meant for fighting-type Pokémon like Hitmonlee or Hitmonchan. Ash would drill on his cardio, power, strength, speed, agility, flexibility and fighting skills, utilizing all of the training techniques that Machamp, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan had taught him. He would run through the field as fast as he could in sprints and go as far as possible when running long distance. He would also practice his fighting skills and techniques on trees and boulders. He would lift weights using dumbbells and barbells, which were also meant for fighting-type Pokémon, and he would stretch himself to great pain in order to further his flexibility. He drilled himself in many other aspects of his own physical abilities, and the reason was because, in his eyes, a trainer should do as he made his Pokémon do. Needless to say, the next 2 weeks were indeed going to be ones of great growth and change. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX journey and thus far, Pikachu had been making increasingly greater gains in power and strength each day. He had managed to learn, in a surprisingly rapid rate of time, Quick Attack, Double Team, Agility and Mega Punch, all in only 1 week of intensive training. His strength, power, agility, speed, endurance and even his Volt power had all increased exponentially, and Ash was very pleased with his Pokémon's progress. The committed and determined young man himself had also been training hard the whole week and was feeling exceptionally strong as well. He believed one more stint of 7-day-long, intensive training would be all they needed before they set out for Viridian City. Of course, their training would never fully stop, but the weeks-long sessions themselves would only happen occasionally, mostly whenever Ash felt that they just needed to take a break from constant traveling. He and Pikachu had just finished another day of rough training and was on the way back to their camp when he heard a loud squawking coming from the north of the wide-open field. After only listening to the sound for a few seconds, he immediately took off in the direction it was coming from, with Pikachu bouncing on his shoulder the whole way. The duo followed the noise to a spot in the field that had a couple scattered trees dispersed here and there and a few shrubs sticking out of the ground. In the middle of the clearing was a flock of angry Spearow attacking a crouching Pokémon whom seemed too scared to move. Ash didn't waste a second at the sight and, with a burning urge to help kindled in his belly, he gave a command to Pikachu as the small electric type jumped down onto the ground, as if reading his trainer's mind. Pikachu used a dispersed thunderbolt to strike down all of those Spearow and scare them away. The red spots on his cheeks started sparking and then he let loose the attack with a loud cry of, "Chew!" From his small, compact body was unleashed a powerful bolt of lightning directed at the flock of angry birds. The attack struck the lot of them with perfect accuracy and they cried out in pain as they were painfully electrocuted. Once the shock had passed, a few of the Spearow turned tail and flew off, but some stayed behind to face their attacker. Instantly, the few remaining Spearow dive-bombed Pikachu and tried to hit him with their peck attacks. Ash, however, calmly instructed him to dodge the attacks, and then the agile mouse began swerving out of the way of the angry and vicious Spearow with practiced ease. Once he was clear of the attacking wave, the boy sharply ordered his Pokémon to use Thunder Wave and knock the Spearow out of the sky. Pikachu did so and quickly launched a widespread electric, arcing wave that immediately hit the tiny bird Pokémon and knocked them from the air. The resulting effect causing them all to hit the ground with a hard crash. All of the small, multicolored birds were now successfully removed from the fight except for one, whom remained standing. A commendable feat considering that it had been beaten up badly and was still sparking from the aftereffects of Pikachu's last attack. Ash was impressed with the Spearow in question and at its display of stout spirit, and thus, he instructed Pikachu to give it a good fight. The mouse Pokémon nodded at his trainer and then turned to face his struggling foe. The small bird suddenly took to the air though with surprising speed and charged at Pikachu with its beak glowing white. Seeing this, Ash was quick to counter. Dodge it, Pikachu, jump to the side to avoid it and then hit it with your tail. He gracefully leapt out of the way just as Spearow was about to hit him with its glowing beak. As it missed and passed by, Pikachu brought his tail around and hit Spearow hard, sending it skidding down through the dirt. Ash then raised his hand. Now Pikachu, end this with tackle. The fast electric type took off running at Spearow and then smashed into it hard with his head, sending the tiny bird Pokémon flying away and hitting the ground, where it no longer attempted to stand back up. Great job, Pikachu, come back. Ash yelled to his first Pokémon in a voice that gave way to his cheer. With that, Pikachu went running back to his trainer's side and then climbed up onto his shoulder, not even a little out of breath from the battle he had just fought. Ash himself pulled out an empty Pokeball from the cloth belt he kept wrapped around his waist and then pointed it at Spearow. Time to capture our first new friend, buddy. He spoke gleefully up to Pikachu with a bright smile. The small Pokémon chirped his agreement and then Ash threw the Pokeball at Spearow. The spherical device soon hit its mark and the unconscious flying type was sucked inside of it. Afterward, the ball fell back to the ground and then commenced to rolling back and forth a few times before it dinged and went still, sparkles of light shooting from the red and white Pokeball to signify a successful capture. Feeling his belly do a happy somersault inside of himself as he witnessed his very first capture of a wild Pokémon, Ash hurried over and picked the ball up from the ground. We did it, buddy. Our first new Pokémon. Seeing and feeling his trainer's excitement as he held the ball up to him, Pikachu pumped its fist excitedly into the air and then high-fived the messy-haired boy. Pie, Pikachu, pie. The young and overjoyed Pokémon trainer simply stared at his first catch proudly, savoring the moment, before finally shrinking and attaching the ball back to his belt. After that, he shifted his gaze and carefully walked over to the Pokémon he and Pikachu had just rescued. The small creature in question was laying on the ground amongst a clump of trodden-down grass, still crouched in a meager defensive position that showed how terrified it was. Once he arrived, cautious not to make any sudden movements, Ash bent down next to the small Pokémon and was finally able to see what it was. The identity of it shocked him, but he knew, without a doubt, that the Pokémon he was now looking at was actually a Budew. After the initial few moments of surprise passed, he honestly couldn't believe that he had actually saved a Budew. They were grass-type Pokémon native to Sinnoh, or any other place Roselia could be found, and were hardly ever seen in Kanto. So, for him to see one so close to his own hometown was puzzling to say the very least. The small grass type soon looked up at him with wide and scared eyes. Ash slowly reached his hand out, showing that he meant no harm, and touched the side of Budew's face comfortingly. The little one slowly relaxed into his touch after a few seconds, realizing the boy meant no harm. Budew. It spoke weakly as the new trainer continued to softly stroke the side of its face. It's all right, little buddy, I won't hurt you. It seems like you might be hurt a little though. If you come back to my camp with me, I can fix you right up. How does that sound? The now safe grass type looked at him for a second, then up at the smiling face of Pikachu, and finally nodded in agreement. Ash smiled softly at that and then picked the small Pokémon up, cradling it gently in his arms as he turned and made his way back to camp. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX went to get his pack in order to retrieve his medical supplies. Upon returning, he sprayed some super potion onto Badoo's cuts and bruises and then gave it an Oran berry so as to recover its strength. After Badoo seemed settled a little and was resting comfortably with its wounds healed, Ash went a ways off so as not to startle it and then released his newly captured Spearow so that he could also dress its own wounds. At first, the small bird looked at him wearily until the boy gently reached out and began stroking its feathers softly in the way Professor Oak taught him flying types loved. It worked as well since it soon had Spearow cooing and gradually relaxing. Seeing his first captured Pokémon relaxing into his touch under the tender ministrations, he smiled and then sprayed some more of the super potion onto Spearow's wounds, instantly healing it. Ash then gave his new Pokémon another Oran berry and continued to stroke the bird's soft feathers as it ate the berry gratefully. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke. "Hey Spearow, I just wanted you to know that I was really impressed with the way you battled against Pikachu earlier. Even though you were outmatched, you still fought back bravely. I can help make you even stronger but only if you're willing to work alongside me and Pikachu as a team and train hard. What do you say? Are you in?" Noticing the boy's gentle kindness to him and having also witnessed the truth behind his words due to how strong Pikachu had been, Spearow didn't have to think about it long and soon cawed happily in reply. "Row. Spearow row." Hearing that, Ash smiled brightly. "All right, we start training tomorrow then so you better be ready." The small Pokémon nodded and cawed again in reply before it turned and began grooming its feathers. The young man decided to take that time to scan Spearow with the Pokédex so he could obtain some more information on his new Pokémon. Therefore, after pulling the high-tech device from his side and scanning the small bird, he listened to what Dexter had to say. Pokédex entry number 021. Spearow, the tiny bird Pokémon. Its reckless nature leads it to stand up to others, even large Pokémon, if it has to protect its territory. Due to its short wings, it can't fly long distances. It wanders about restlessly and pecks at bug Pokémon. This Spearow is male and has the abilities Keen Eye and Sniper. This Pokémon knows the moves, Peck, Leer, Fury Attack and Pursuit. After hearing all of the information provided to him, Ash was impressed with Spearow's moves and abilities. In time, he could become a very strong Pokémon and given the tenacious nature he had already displayed, combined with the right training of course, such a reality was not a fantasy. And with someone as determined as Ash as his trainer, it definitely would be a possibility with no exaggeration. The young Ketchum didn't bother scanning Badoo, on the other hand, since it wasn't a native of the Kanto region and no information would be available for it on a Pokédex that wasn't internationally programmed. His own was not, but fortunately enough, he didn't need it anyway. This was all due to the fact that, in a general sense, he roughly knew almost everything he needed to know about most of the Pokémon he would be encountering, thanks in part to his constant studying and all of Professor Oak's invaluable teachings. As well as, of course, a very adept memory that allowed him to remember most of the things he learned. The only thing he really needed his Pokédex for at the current point in time was to tell him what abilities and gender each new Pokémon he captured had and also what moveset they currently possessed. Other than that, he was already rather knowledgeable when it came to Pokémon and most of what he needed to know about a large majority of them. The only thing that Ash currently knew about Badoo was that it was female and that was about it. He knew this due to a secret Professor Oak had taught him concerning grass types. That being how female ones would usually have a somewhat lighter green tint to their bodies than their male counterparts due to a lesser amount of internal chlorophyll production. "Hey Spearow," he spoke again after a few seconds. The small flying type turned his head and looked at the boy, tilting his head in a way that showed he was listening. Seeing that he had his Pokémon's attention, Ash looked over his shoulder and then back at Spearow. When we go back over to the campsite, would you mind keeping a little distance from Badoo? Just for a little while. I know you were just doing what wild Pokémon do, but Badoo might be a bit uneasy around you at first since you and your flock attacked it earlier. Think you can keep a little space until it knows you aren't gonna hurt it? Spearow blinked at him once before looking over toward the campsite where Pikachu and Badoo were at. Apparently he understood because, after looking at Ash and nodding again, he simply spread his small wings and then flew up into a tree that was hanging over the tent. It was high up enough that Badoo wouldn't easily see him and become intimidated or scared. Therefore, Spearow simply settled down onto a branch and then commenced to grooming his feathers again. With that settled, Ash smiled to himself in satisfaction and then went over to the campsite. A few moments later, while sitting on a big rock that he had built his fire pit in front of, he was going through his Pokédex when, suddenly, he felt something touching his right leg. Looking down, he saw Badoo looking up at him. Smiling, he turned and asked, "What's up, Badoo?" The small grass type looked up at the empty Pokéballs on his belt and began pointing to it by gesturing forward with the bud on top of her head. Ash looked to where Badoo was pointing and then glanced back at her. He appeared to be in a mild state of confusion for a time before, finally, thank Arceus, he seemed to understand as the boy ventured a tentative guess. "Do you want to come with me too, Badoo?" The little Pokémon nodded excitedly and started jumping up and down, showing her gratitude for how he had saved her. Bud, Badoo. Ash smiled brightly as he heard her positive affirmation. Though he would have admitted to being slightly surprised at Badoo's desire to join him on his journey, and so soon at that one look at Pikachu's smiling face said it all. The yellow mouse probably had a paw in convincing the Hoenn grass type to come along with them. Nodding to his first Pokémon in gratitude, Ash pulled another Pokéball from his cloth belt and looked back at Badoo. "Okay then, welcome to the team." With that said, he touched the ball to her head and then, just like with Spearow, she was sucked inside of it and didn't struggle for even a moment as the round device dinged, signifying a successful capture. Afterwards, Ash grinned happily as he held up Badoo's new Pokéball to Pikachu. "Alright buddy. We got another friend to add to the team." The fiery electric type nodded just as gladly as his trainer and chirped excitedly back. "Pie Pika Pie." The boys soon released Badoo and then he and Pikachu, along with their two newest friends, relaxed and enjoyed the rest of the evening by the campfire. Spearow eventually came down out of the tree and joined them by perching on Ash's shoulder while Pikachu laid on his lap and Badoo sat on the rock beside of him. At first, the newly captured grass type seemed a little weary of the flying type, but, after Ash reassured her and Pikachu convinced Spearow into giving her a placating chirp of peace, Badoo gradually became more comfortable around him. A little farther into the night, Ash even saw the two of them communicating with one another by Pikachu's influence, which led him to believing that they were on their way to making amends. A thought that brought him great personal comfort. On the morrow, they would begin their second week of training and it would prove to be the toughest by far. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX successful for all of them, Ash included. Pikachu continued to train hard in his grueling routine and continued getting stronger every day. Ash himself made sure that he kept increasing the intensity on Pikachu so the training never became easy and thereby stalled his progress. Spearow and Badoo had also begun their own training during the last week and were coming along very nicely. He had set them up on a strict diet of Pokémon food geared for each of their types, just like with Pikachu, which he had spent the past 7 days experimenting on. He also fed each of them Poffins so that they were getting everything they needed nutrition-wise. The student of Professor Oak decided that he would make each Pokémon he had go through the same kind of intense physical conditioning program. The 3 of them would drill their endurance, stamina, strength, power, speed, agility, flexibility and every other physical attribute they possessed to their absolute max. Ash didn't want to have a Pokémon that was better in any area, physically, than another. He wanted them all to be equal and at the same level wherever possible. The only thing that would individualize each of their training programs would be when it came to type-specific training. The regimens themselves were very strict and precise. All of his Pokémon would work on their moves first, mastering each one they knew before trying to learn new ones. After that, they would work on type disadvantage training. This sort of unique training revolved around them subjecting themselves constantly to every kind of move and element they were weak to until they built higher levels of tolerance against those aforementioned weaknesses. If he didn't have a Pokémon who knew a move that Ash needed for the one he was working with, he would try and recreate that element himself, if possible, and attack them with it. Fire and water were admittedly the easiest to replicate. His trio of Pokémon also worked out with free weights or wore body weights while they trained. To further round out their integrated and effective training regimen, Pikachu, Budew and Spearow took part in fighting and martial arts drills so their reaction time and combat skills would sharply improve. Of course, unlike Pikachu, the latter two had to do modified versions of such programs due to their physiologies. Spearow, for example, was only able to use his wings and body for anything combat-oriented and likewise, Budew could only use her legs. It was difficult but they managed. Ash would also have them drill extremely hard on physical skills that they were naturally not adept at. Such as having Spearow run on the ground wearing body weight so that he could become accustomed to moving on the ground as easily as he flew in the air. Or by making Budew more agile on her feet when running, jumping and climbing since she didn't have arms to assist in those endeavors. Overall, the zealous young man worked his Pokémon to the bone in just about every different form of training he could think of. He wanted them to have as few weaknesses that their opponents could exploit as possible, and the only way to do that was if they trained into the ground, hard, every day and drilled on every type of training angle they could. Yet again, Ash was glad that he had studied so hard for 5 years. Otherwise, he would never have known about so many different types of training methods. The best part was though, he had already learned how to create and develop a few new kinds of workout regimens just by working with the 3 Pokémon he had captured since leaving home. Of course, reading new books on the subject every chance he had definitely didn't hinder that initiative either. At the current moment, Ash had just finished his own training for the day and was now off to get Pikachu, Spearow and Budew so he could relieve them from their own. Eventually, he made it to the Rock Hollow, where he found the 3 of them engaging in the final stretch of their training. Pikachu was practicing focused lightning on a nearby boulder and was just starting to crack the rock. Budew was over at a nearby tree, panting heavily as she practiced her absorb attack on it. She was trying to focus on absorbing as much energy from the tree as she could, and then she would put it back into the tree by redirecting the flow of the energy. This was how Ash was trying to get her to learn more powerful absorption moves like Mega Drain and Giga Drain. Besides the physical training program that Budew underwent with both Pikachu and Spearow, the aforementioned regimen was how she spent the entirety of her training. She would practice all of her grass types moves and make them as powerful as she could while, at the same time, attempting to learn new moves and then perfect those. She started off knowing Absorb, Growth and Stun Spore. Although she had learned in the last week, Razor Leaf, Sunny Day, Leech Seed and Synthesis. Budew was coming along very nicely in her training and Ash was thoroughly impressed at just how fast she grew in strength, learned new attacks and then mastered them. Even for a grass type. After working with her for a while, he also learned that she possessed the amazing and extremely rare set of 3 abilities, Natural Cure, Poison Point and Leaf Guard. Then again, after watching her train the way she did, there was no denying, she really was a special Pokémon indeed. The fact she knew Leech Seed instead of Worry Seed, as most all Budew did, was unusual as well since, normally, only Roselia knew that move. Ash also still didn't know how she ended up in Kanto or why, but he didn't care. All he knew was that he had a great Pokémon with amazing potential and he was happy. Soon, he directed his attention a little farther away and saw Spearow flying low to the ground. The small but speedy bird was going as fast as he could while weaving in and out amongst all of the big boulders that were strewn everywhere in the rock hollow. He was also wearing body weights which were specially made for flying types, that way he could become even stronger through the added resistance of weight on his wings. Over the last week, Spearow had gotten much faster, and not just while flying but also when running on the ground. All of his physical attributes had increased impressively, and he had even learned 2 new moves, Aerial Ace and Agility. Ash could tell that Spearow was definitely going to become a very strong Pokémon just by seeing his improvement over the last week alone. He eventually called his Pokémon back in after watching them train for a few minutes, and they all went hurrying to meet him. After he had greeted them all and commended their efforts, they made their way back to camp so they could eat supper and then relax. Once they had arrived back in camp and ate supper, they all settled around the campfire that Ash had lit and began to unwind. He looked at his Pokémon after a few moments of silence and then addressed them. "Alright guys. Tomorrow, we head out for Viridian City. We've been training hard and we'll continue to do so on the road, but we need to get going now." He smiled at the 3 of them and nodded. "I'm really happy with all of your progress so far, and I know you'll keep getting stronger. We might end up getting a lot of new friends on our journey, and it'll be up to you 3 to help me raise them and turn them into strong members of the team. I'm gonna try to help make every Pokémon I have the strongest they can possibly be, but I also want us all to act like a family and be there for one another. Can I count on you 3 to help me?" He quickly received a rousing chorus of positive replies from his Pokémon, and he smiled again. "Good, I'm glad to hear it. Now what do you say we go get some sleep so we can be ready to leave first thing tomorrow morning?" The 3 excited and determined young Pokémon agreed, and with that decided, Ash returned Spearow and Badoo before putting out the fire and then heading to his tent with Pikachu. He was ready for tomorrow's venture to Viridian City, and after all the preparing they had done, the young Pokémon Master hopeful knew his team was as well. Whatever they encountered they would face together, and for him, that was all that mattered.